going to go ahead and get started, and people will be joining here as we go. But I want to welcome everyone to today's NIMLAS workshop. We're very happy to have Christine, Tony, Jess, and Noah with us today. They'll be presenting a workshop on measuring social relations, a multidimensional concept. My name is Brady West, and I'm one of the MPIs of the NIMLAS network. I'm joined here by Sung-Hee Lee and Esther Friedman. They're also an MPI. Sung-Hee is an MPI, and Esther is a co-I of NIMLAS. So we're very happy that everyone was able to join us today, and we're very grateful for our four presenters for putting together this workshop and making it available to everyone live right now, and then everyone who will be watching this recording down the road when it gets posted on the NIMLAS website. So just as a reminder, this is being recorded. So after the workshop is over, we will be recording or posting the recording on the NIMLAS website. Noah is also going to be sharing the slides here with you to start with so that everybody can follow along as we're walking through the slides. So we'll let Noah do that when everybody's introducing themselves. Just by way of logistics, if you have any questions, it'll probably be best, given the large audience that we're anticipating, if you just enter those questions in the chat. I'll then relay those back to our presenters. We'll probably either do that in real time or maybe during breaks that they have scheduled. We'll see how it goes. But I'll chime in and interrupt. We're also going to have some polls and other activities that you guys can work on during the workshop. So stay tuned for all of that as well. I'll also be putting the NIMLAS website in the chat, so stay tuned to that for news, updates, and events. All of you who are members of NIMLAS working groups, stay tuned for more information about upcoming meetings. We would love to see you at those working group meetings, which are really driving the focus of NIMLAS activities moving forward. And just very quickly, the next NIMLAS call for pilot projects will probably be coming sometime in October. So you can stay tuned for more information about that. And you can read more about other pilot projects at the website when I post that here. So, okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the workshop team, and I'll allow you guys to each introduce yourselves, say a little bit more about your background, and then Noah, you're welcome to share the slides and the materials with everybody via the chat. So welcome everyone and enjoy the workshop. Thank you.
So Brady, just to start, I'll just drop the PDF in the chat right now in case people want
Sure.
to download those and follow along rather than seeing it on the share screen.
Yep, and we'll be posting the materials and everything else on the NIMLAS website after the workshop is over as well. So, yep.
Well,
Okay, looks good. We can see that. So,
all right. So we'll just start by introducing ourselves. Let's go in order as listed here. So Christine, do you want to go first?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking time to be here. My name is Christine Ajrush, and I am a research professor in the Research Center for Group Dynamics at the Institute for Social Research, trained as a sociologist, and have spent the last 25 years or so thinking very deeply about and studying social relations. So really excited to be here.
All right. Tony, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Tony Antonucci. I'm a lifespan developmental psychologist with appointments here at ISR in the Life Course Development Program and the Department of Psychology. I study social relations across the lifespan and have worked with these folks, Christine, Noah, and more recently Jess, for quite a number of years. And I think we make a great team.
All right, I'll jump in. I'm Jess Francis Levin. I am a research investigator in Life Course Development Program. And my background is in information and media science, and I focus on technology use and social relations with a particular focus on aging and more specifically folks who are prone to social isolation. So thanks for having me.
Hello, everybody. And to echo Christine, thanks for joining us and coming to this workshop. My name is Noah Webster. I'm also at the Institute for Social Research in the Survey Research Center. I'm an associate research scientist, and I'm trained as a sociologist. And I've been working in the Life Course Development Program, studying social relations for almost 18 years. So looking forward to sharing some of the insights and things we've learned over that time. So here's an outline of our workshop today to give you an expectation of the flow. So we'll start off with a little bit of background on why social relations matter. Why should we even care or think about or be concerned about this topic matter? And then we'll cover the theory that underlies the measurement approach that we use predominantly to study social relations. And this is the convoy model of social relations. And then we'll turn to the specifics of the measurement. There's a specific tool that stems from and parallels the convoy model. It's called the hierarchical mapping technique. And we'll talk a little bit about another approach within that, but most of the attention and time will be spent covering the hierarchical mapping technique. And then we have an exercise where we're going to ask you all to map your personal social convoys, because we've learned over time when talking about this measure with others that it's useful to talk about it in the abstract, but it's also useful when people think about it in their own lives as well. You kind of get an ingrained sense of how the measure works, what it means, and some challenges that might be experienced when you're administering this with respondents in different formats, whether a face-to-face interview, a telephone interview, et cetera. And then we have some empirical examples that we'll go through where we've used these measures and these data in our studies. And then we'll pause for question and answer, but we also welcome questions at different points throughout the talk as well, realizing that you might have a question earlier on. It might be better for us to talk through and address that earlier in the presentation. But we'll pause, and if anybody has a question that hasn't asked it already, we'll take them then as well. Then we'll have a short break. And then we'll turn to this topic of communication technologies, because we are at a time where we're experiencing changes in technology, and these technologies are having dramatic impacts on how people communicate with a range of people, from people they might not know very well to very close people that they might not have talked to or experienced these new technologies in the past. And that'll cover a range of different subtopics on this broader topic of communication technologies, including the recent adaptations to the convoy model that have been done and proposed to incorporate these new technologies, and thinking about how these new technologies are impacting our social relations and how we communicate and engage with our social relations. And then we'll have a second exercise building upon the first exercise, but specifically thinking about and mapping your social or your cell phone social network. And then some empirical examples stemming from this, and another Q&A, and then we'll have some wrap up. So before we kick off, we just wanted to make some acknowledgements. And the first is to the broader community that we call the Life Course Development Program, which is here at the University of Michigan. This is comprised of graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, a number of research faculty and others, and staff who've been working with us on these studies, some of which you're going to hear about today. And we thank them for their many contributions and insights that have both informed and shaped and impacted this work going forward. And second, we'd like to acknowledge that this work would not be possible without the support from multiple funding agencies, including the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health, as well as the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and predominantly the National Institute on Aging. So to start, I'm guessing many of you this is probably going to be a review from a lot of you since you're here, may have seen the topic. So knowing that you're interested in this topic of social relations or social networks, but just to cover a few reasons why is it important to study social relations? And for many of us, and maybe people who are skeptics about the important role of social relations, the COVID-19 pandemic did a dramatic job about helping the case for why social relations matter when people were forced to distance from them physically. So that helped our case in many ways. But these are some more broad points we'd like to make. So the first is that social relations have been shown, and there's an increasingly large literature showing that they are linked to a whole host of health outcomes. This ranges from mental health outcomes, physical health, functional health, et cetera, and also survival and longevity outcomes. Social relations also have been shown to directly impact health behaviors. And this is is also a link for why it is impacting health across many health domains. It's the fact that they impact what you eat, how you exercise, how often, who you exercise with, and just as a couple of examples, whether or not you smoke, et cetera. And social relations matter also because increasing literature has shown that they vary across contexts. So we need more research to understand, because context can be defined very broadly. Like, for example, some of our recent work has shown that social relations and the development of them over time depends on the neighborhoods that people live in. It also depends on age. So that's the lifespan, or the life course context influences the characteristics of a person's social network. Also, social relations matter because they're multidimensional, and that's why we need a scientific study of social relations. And we know that social relations can be described and characterized in terms of their structure, and I'll talk more about this later, what we mean by that. Also in terms of their composition, who is in the social network. And also, not all people in our social networks are equal. Some of them, they vary in terms of their quality, both positive and negative aspects. And social relations also are experienced as well as measured and analyzed, which we'll cover and go into more depth later in the workshop at multiple levels. So for example, at the individual level, and we call this the egocentric approach, and this is the most focus that we're going to be doing in this workshop. And there may be other workshops, maybe in the future, or others that offer it focused on this other approach that's called the sociocentric approach, which is also a valuable perspective on social networks and social relations. And that's more at the group level. Like, for example, if you were studying a set of students in a classroom or a number of older adults who live in the same apartment building, the sociocentric approach can be used for that, as well as the individual approach that we call the egocentric. It really depends on your research question and which one you want to apply, or you could use a hybrid and use them both. I'll have an example of that later. And social relations also are important because they involve both the subjective life experience as well as objective aspects, like many other aspects of our lives. And in particular, the subjective aspects include, for example, who you feel close to. And that's going to vary from person to person. And how close you feel to them. That's really a subjective experience. It's perceived, it's attitudinal. So if you ask two people, and they both might acknowledge that they have a tie or a connection, a relationship, whether it's because of family ties or because they feel close to one another. You ask them both that they have that tie, but they might vary in terms of how close they feel with each other. And we've seen that in the data that we've collected. But then there's also an objective aspect to the social relations. Like, for example, we take the geographic distance of those in your network. So that's more where we would expect it to vary less if we ask the two people who are talked about. Like if you nominated a sibling, if you have a sibling in your social network, and you would know whether or not they live within an hour's drive of you. But if you asked how close each of you feels to each other, that is likely to vary, and it's attitudinal and subjective. So this is a figure that I'm sure many of you have seen. It's based on a meta-analysis by Julianne Holt-Lundstad and colleagues, which really drives home to us and others, both who study social relations, but maybe those who don't, the importance of social relations for health, well-being, as well as longevity and survival. So from this meta-analysis, Julianne showed that social relations in multiple aspects, so looking at social relations overall, that's that top line, as well as looking at the subdimension of social relations of social support, and then other measures of social integration, the third one, have the strongest influence on how long people live. And this is even beyond many well-known things that we would assume are important for survival, which this shows that they still are, but that social relations above and beyond, and more importantly so, determines how long you live. And that includes, for example, smoking, vaccines, physical activity, etc. So it really drives home the importance and the benefit of social relations can make in terms of longevity and survival. Another thing I wanted to highlight is that social relations increasingly so have been documented to be related to cognitive health. And there's increasing evidence that it can delay mild cognitive impairment, for example. And why does this matter? Because Alzheimer's disease and related dementias are dramatically increasing. And in particular, literature has shown that 50% of the cases of ADRD are preventable. So social relations has been documented and shown and argued to be one of those preventable causes, which is modifiable. So the research has shown that older adults who are more engaged socially are generally better off health-wise, less likely to develop ADRD. And as I noted just a second ago, it could slow the progress of mild cognitive impairment. So now I'm going to transition to talking about theory. So as I mentioned before, the theory that we're going to focus on, in particular because it parallels the measurement technique that we utilize most often in our studies, the hierarchical mapping technique, is informed by the convoy model of social relations. So this is not the only theory of social relations out there, and it's one that we want to highlight and it informs our work. But there are others out there, like, for example, social emotional selectivity theory, social contagion theory, etc. So I just want to highlight that this is one theory that's used in there and it informs our work.
Here's a point where I might interject. Noah asked me to add comments if they became relevant, but here's one I'd just like to say. This theory is, as it says there, Bob Kahn and I created this theory, but what I like most about this theory is that Bob, who was trained as an organizational social psychologist, and I trained as a lifespan developmental psychologist, we really didn't know much about our two different perspectives, but came together and educated each other about our respective backgrounds, and hence this theory, which is kind of a combination. I mean, the most easily seen by the personal characteristics, which is more lifespan development, and the situational characteristics, which is more organizational psychology, came together because we would fight about these things. It was great fun. I mean, fight in a fun way about which was more important. And as you can see from this model, nobody won that argument. We ended up agreeing that both were equally important, and then that's how it appeared in what we ended up calling the spaceship model, because if you turn it upside down or on its side, it looks like a spaceship. Anyway, sorry for interrupting, but I thought you might like that story.
Thanks, Tony. And we hope to continue that interdisciplinary continued work with you as a lifespan developmental psychologist, sociologist, myself and Christine, and Jess as a gerotechnologist, bringing in new perspectives on this. So thank you. So what are convoys of social relations? So as originally conceptualized by Tony and Bob when they developed the model, they are thought of as people who surround an individual. They protect and socialize and shape the individual in key important ways. And one of the ways that the model hypothesizes that the social convoy influences the individual is it impacts their health and well-being. And this was meant, as Tony noted, as a lifespan, life course process. So some of the origins, as Tony and Bob discussed in the original writings of the model, and there was a couple citations there that are in the slide, so you can go do, you can delve more into those readings in the early writings about the model if you would like. So this term convoy was developed by Plath in the 1980s, and it was stemmed from work that was done in Japan, where there was described a communal living or a group of people living together, in particular focused on how the Japanese children were being raised in this context. And the convoy was thought and characterized and described as having a protective function for these children in this community setting. And in thinking about that, the convoy is particularly important for helping people navigate and go through, in a positive way, their age-related events. So like, for example, certain events that would be developmentally important across age milestones. And as Tony noted, that the model was developed combining perspectives from developmental psychology as well as social psychology. And then also from reading the early work that Bob and Tony written on the model, it also ties in different aspects of the sociological tradition of symbolic interactionism, which I know has some parallels and overlap with social psychology. And it's also grounded in research on attachments, roles, as well as organizations. So there's a social psychology organizational perspective, Tony, that you noted that Bob incorporated into it, as well as your work on attachment and developmental psychology. So also, as Tony noted, there's the convoy model is rooted and grounded in both psychology's perspective of lifespan, as well as the more what we think of in sociology as the life course perspective. So it draws on both. So both the convoy model understands the human experience to be, in both these lifespan and life course perspectives, the human experience to be long-term and lifelong, multi-level, contextual, as well as dynamic and changing. And also these two perspectives have informed the convoy model's understanding that this process, in particular social relations, are influenced by both macro and micro influences. So this could be characterized as both gains and losses in a person's life, as well as risks and resiliencies that they encounter. So going a little bit more on this concept about what do we mean by multidimensional when we say that convoys are multidimensional. And as it was in the title of our workshop, I'll go into a little bit more about that. So by that, we mean that our convoys and convoys in general can be described in terms of their quantity. So that's what we think about in terms of their structure and their composition. And convoys can also be described in terms of the quality of the relationships amongst the people within the convoys. And as I noted earlier, the quality as it's been studied most recently is thought of as both positive relationship quality. So if you think about how positive your relationship is with specific people in your social network, as well as we can aggregate this up to across the whole network or to specific types of relationships. And also that things are not always positive, that relationships can also be negative. And you can experience positivity as well as negativity in the same relationships simultaneously. And a point that I'll revisit later on, but I want to highlight now, is that these are not meant to be different ends of the same concept or measure, but really positive relationship quality and negative relationship quality are conceptualized and have been demonstrated through their psychometric properties to be unique concepts that vary and have higher or lower positivity and higher or lower negativity on their own. As I mentioned, the same relationship has been found to be both positive and negative at certain times. So in terms of quantity, a little bit more depth on this. So when we think about quantity of social relations, this is what we describe in terms of the structure of our social relations. So going back to that rocket ship model, so there's the structure has its own box. And some examples of structural measures of social relations or the social convoy include the size of a person's convoy. So when you think about the number of people that are in it, so this could be the number of people that you feel close and important to. That would be a measure of your social convoy structure. Another structural measure is a frequency of contact. And we'll go over some more specific wording and measures of these later on, but I just want to highlight at the conceptual level. So this would be how often you're in contact with each of the people in your network, and this can be averaged up to describe your entire social network, your entire social convoy. Another measure is the proximity of your network. How geographically close or far are the people in your network? And understanding that it likely varies from person to person in your social network. And this measure will help quantify that. Another aspect of quantity is composition. So by composition, we're thinking of who is in the social network and what are their characteristics. So this could be, what's the age composition of your social network? Does your social network have a large age variation from really young people to infants all the way up to very old people? And what's the gender composition of your social network? So we can quantify and determine that. And another measure of composition that we typically use and has been found to be particularly impactful in our work is relationship. So who is that person in your social network? And it could be a family member, it could be a friend, a coworker, et cetera. And there's many ways that you can categorize and look at this relationship measure. So again, in terms of quality, we mean by that both the positive aspects of the relationship and some examples and ways that we've measured this include so-and-so. You could fill in the blank in their name if you're administering this in a survey. Or my mother, my father, a sibling helps me when I'm sick. And then we ask respondents to how much do they agree or disagree with these statements? How much does so-and-so, how much do I receive encouragement from my mother or father or sibling, et cetera? And in terms of negativity, that's viewed as not negativity on the severe end of the scale, but thinking about it more in terms of our relationships. Because again, when we think about our social convoy, we have to think about these are people that are close and important in our life. But those people who are close and important do sometimes get on our nerves and they make us frustrated and they sometimes make too many demands of us. So this is a way to capture and measure that as well. And a side note, that in some of our recent work and thinking about that work from Julianne Holt-Lundstad about longevity and survival, we did some of our recent work. We found that it was the negativity among an adult child that was found to be driving people living longer, which was sort of a counterintuitive finding because you would think that it's the positive aspects of relationships, the support people receive, feeling supported, emotionally well-being, et cetera. We did find that too. The positive part did influence how long the respondents in our study lived, but the negative part also did too, in particular among those who were chronically ill. And when we were talking about the finding, we were seeing parallels with what others in the field had been finding around the same time. So some of the thinking is that the getting on the nerves, making too many demands might be in the area of you need to eat better, you need to get a little more exercise, might be interpreted by the respondent as those health nudges and be a little frustrating, but maybe it actually does end up in those health behaviors happening and the person living longer is how we interpreted that finding.
But sometimes want to outlast the other person out of spite. I've actually heard somebody say that. I'm going to outlive that SOB because he's so mean, but I deserve to live longer, or some kind of logic like that. It's remarkable. But anyway, sometimes negativity gives you the energy to stay alive.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That, yeah, you're right. That was our second alternative explanation for that potential finding on the
And,
more,
and the
any
alternate
more
about
jaded side.
the alternative about positive is somebody once suggested this argument. I feel a little ambivalent about it, but they said that especially if you know, if you're terminally ill, for example, and I think we have a paper on this, if you're terminally ill, you'd rather die sooner than later so that your loved ones don't have to deal with it. I mean, that doesn't sound nice, but to kind of relieve your loved ones from a long prolonged experience of watching you decline and die.
So continuing on with the convoy. So as demonstrated earlier in that rocket ship model, so the convoy model hypothesizes that the convoys are influenced by antecedent factors. So those are on the far left. So there was a personal characteristics box and a situational characteristics. So the convoy model argues that our convoys, that is the structure, as well as the composition, are influenced by these key individual characteristics, which can be both ascribed characteristics, such as our age, gender, race, ethnicity, as well as the achieved characteristics, such as education. And the second hypothesis in that rocket ship model is that our convoys are influenced, again, the structure of who's in them, the composition, the size, etc., are influenced by situational characteristics. And as originally conceptualized and written about in the early writings of Tony's and Bob's, this was talked about in terms of roles that people have in society. We can think about this as if a person is married or has a significant other or partner, so that could be a marital or partner status. Whether or not a person has children, so their parental status, as well as their employment status. And the understanding that these roles are not static, that they change over time. And the convoy model really provided an understanding for both how these roles at a certain point in time in cross-sectional investigations could be influential for what type of social networks you have, the structure and the quantity, as well as how these things change over time and how that then influences our dynamic, lifelong, lifespan, life course processes, and how our social networks and social convoys change over those processes. So to illustrate and articulate that a little bit, we show here what these are hypothetical convoys. These are not based on real data, but it shows what a person's convoy, how they might change across the life cycle and the lifespan. If we go from, on the far left is a 6-month-old infant, where they're predominantly a very small social convoy, and this predominantly includes their mother, father, their siblings, their grandparents might be in the middle circle. So again, this is beginning to introduce you to the hierarchical mapping technique and the concept of these interrelated circles and closeness. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. But again, with the person in the middle, and we think about the convoys as having these protective layers, and it's dimensional, it varies based on emotional closeness. So then as a person ages, maybe this 10-year-old child, you see the numbers of people in their convoy or who they feel close and important to increases. But some of the people may shift, like we might bring in friends. And we have a new type of composition, such as teammates, if they're playing organized sports or activities. And then classmates who they're seeing every day and then feel particularly maybe close to because they're seeing them every day. And I'll pause for this because it raises an anecdote. Tony, I don't know if you want to mention some of the early development work you all did of the measure, where you were asking like really young children about proximity and geographic closeness, and you found a very interesting gender finding. I just wanted to, if you want to talk about that for a second.
First thing I'll just tell you, it's a fun fact. When we were trying to find a way to get little kids to tell us how close, our initial findings were that some people, boys versus girls, were what psychologists called concrete operational. So if you asked a girl how close they were, they'd say your very best friend, etc. But if you asked a boy, he'd say, well, this is my closest, he lives next door. This is my next closest, he lives around the corner. So that was a problem. So then and we had to work through that. But then another thing we did, which was from my own childhood, my dad used to say to me, how much do you love me? And I would go this much. And he would say, how much? And I'd go this much. And he'd say, that, only that much. And then I'd go like that. And then we tried to come up with a way to concretize that in terms of getting people and knowing that children could conceptualize this concept of closeness or how much you love a person. So what we were trying to do was concretize that and make it in a visual that people would understand.
And I think that ended up in your decision for why the Detroit-based regionally representative sample that you launched the study, which is still ongoing longitudinally, that launched in 1992, why you ended up going with age 8 as the lowest age.
Because the boys couldn't do it. The girls could do it at 5, but the boys couldn't do it. So we just kept going up. And my kids, and we went, and I literally went around to all my friends and asked them based on how old their kids were. And at first I asked my kids' friends, so I have 2 daughters. So I was writing it up, literally writing it up for, the preliminary study section of a grant. And I realized they were all girls because I have girls. So then my friends, when I was looking towards the friends of my kids, they were all girls. And I thought, oh, well, I probably should get boys too. And no, what difference would it make? What difference could it possibly make? but I couldn't get myself to write it in the in the preliminary studies without doing some boys too. So I went out and asked my friends, and like these kids are now 40 years old. So I remember that because these were my very best friends' kids. And when I asked the boys, it was like a disaster. I mean, not a disaster, but they didn't think about it in that level of detail. They didn't think it abstractly about those relationships.
And that's a nice methodological note you have in there, Tony. So when doing your pretest, whether it's a survey of social relations or some other measure, make sure you have diversity and what your key measures or key variables.
Yep. And even when you know the right answer, or you know the answer you're going to get, remember you're an empirical scientist and you got to go out and find out if you were right about it. In that case, we were only half right.
So continuing forward, that same individual from when they were an infant to when they're 10 years old. So then this might be how their social convoy then continues to change to when they're 35 to when they're 75. So for example, maybe the sibling closeness might vary as geographic proximity might change, and closeness might then be related to and change with that. Maybe they move to what we call the middle circle. And then other distant relatives moving to outer circle and less close. And then when a person becomes older and maybe other new convoy members become introduced through the introduction of grandchildren, for example, for some, and friends play a role in things like that. So you see here as these hypothetical examples, and hopefully this will be ingrained a little bit more when we do the exercise with you all, where we have you map your own personal social network, social convoy at this point in time. So a couple of kind of summary wrap-up slides as we think about the theory and some things we want you to have in the back of your mind as we then move and transition to the details about the measure that parallels this. So the contributions that the model has made to the broader literature and the broader focus on social relations is that it's really a parsimonious representation of what is really a complex human experience, and that has so much variation across individuals. And another really key contribution is the multidimensionality to this. As we noted, in two of these multidimensions, or the two of these dimensions are the quantity and the quality of a person's social relations, and they really are distinct, but they influence each other, but they really do shape outcomes, health outcomes and other outcomes in really key and important ways, and sometimes in different ways. So it really highlights that you need to study both the quantity of social relations as well as quality. And it's really not, is it quantity versus quality? We sometimes have that debate and discussion in our group. It's not quantity versus quality, but you really can't have a quality of social relations without some type of quantity. You need to have that social relations and the existence that have an informed quality. So they really work together, but sometimes inform our understanding of social relations in key and important different ways. And also another key contribution of the model to the broader literature is that it moved early on a movement from beyond thinking about global measures of social relationships. So for example, some studies have asked about, so early on, as Tony mentioned, that early measures of social relations were considered, is a person married or not? And that was used as a determination of whether or not a person had social support. And I think
given all we know about social relations now, can you imagine that big names in this field thought all you need for a measurement of social relations was, is this person married or not? That was it. I could go on about that, but I should do it privately and with a glass of wine.
And another contribution is the focus on both incorporation of perspectives from both the developmental lifespan as well as sociological tradition of the life course, and really understanding that the development of social relations and our social convoys is a dynamic, lifelong process, and really builds on our previous experience and incurs significance over time. So incorporating some of the thinking about cumulative advantage and disadvantage as well. Is another contribution is the focus and understanding that there's both objective as well as subjective components to the understanding of social relations and social convoys. And the last one we want to highlight is the contextual, the importance of context and the situational aspect of social relations. And we've done some recent thinking and further refinement of what is meant by these situational contexts that are important for developing social relations, and moving beyond the personal or the roles, and thinking about how environmental contexts, like the natural environments that a person's been embedded in or is exposed to, as we think about severe weather events happening, and how that might inform or shape or change a person's social networks or make them more vulnerable, or create new forms of risk that were not always there. So a couple, again, just to summarize, so convoy models of social relations are a lifespan concept. They're also longitudinal, they're hierarchical, and thinking about those circles that we showed with the U nested in the middle. They can be both positive and negative. Some might be more positive all the time, some might be more negative, but some can be both positive and negative at the same time. And our social relations are also multi-generational, so they have that age composition and dimension to them. They can also have ethnic, religious, and cultural characteristics to them. And they also have antecedents as well as consequences. So now I'm going to change topics and now move into the measurement side of this, building on the theory as the groundwork and the foundation. So the measurement tool that is used, that was developed by Tony, that stems from the model, the convoy model of social relations, it's called the hierarchical mapping technique. And there's a citation that's here in the bottom that if you'd like to read more, that's the original writing of it. So as we mentioned before, where it's multidimensional and it's also hierarchical. So when administering this in a survey, so another name for this tool, as I mentioned before, that there's multiple theories and perspectives out there of social relations. And just as so, there are multiple measurement tools out there to measure social networks. And the hierarchical mapping technique falls under the broader category of what's called an egocentric measure of social networks. This is not in opposition to, but in distinction to another type of social network measurement tool called a sociocentric measurement approach. And I'll have a couple slides on that in a little bit, but that's where you're more measuring like a bounded or some type of network that you can define, like a group of students in a classroom, or as I mentioned earlier, a set of residents living in an apartment building. That's where the sociocentric approach could be applied and used. Another name for the measurement tool, like the hierarchical mapping technique, it's called a name generator. So you're basically asking people to generate and come up with names of people who are in their social network, in this case, their social convoy. So we usually go through a number of steps that we do this when administering it in a study or in a survey. And the first step involves asking people to make nominations of people into their network based on varying levels of closeness. So that's how the convoy model characterizes the social convoys and the social networks based on this closeness. And other types of studies have used it based on other types of characteristics. So for example, there's what's called confidant networks. So you would ask people to nominate people based on how often they talk to people about important matters, just to show you a distinction between how you define the network is important. And the hierarchical mapping technique did this based on closeness because that stemmed directly from the convoy model and understanding about the hierarchical and multidimensional nature of social relations. So asking for people to make nominations, so that is give specific names of people who are in their life, who are close and important to them based on varying levels, again, based on these concentric circle rings. And then the second part, then it allows for the collection of detailed data on the specific people that are named. So after the name generation part, then you then follow up with by the specific people who are named to ask specific characteristics and information on those individuals. And those characteristics questions can be modified depending on whatever your research question is. And we'll have some examples of that in a little bit. So now to go into a little more detail about how you actually administer this measure. So as I mentioned before, the first step is nomination. So if in the context of a survey, you ask people to name those individuals. And hopefully this makes a little more concrete sense when we ask you to do this for yourselves. So then what you can do is count the number of people who are listed in the respondent's inner circle. So back to here, that's that first circle, or after the U, that's the inner circle. And then you could count the number of people who are nominated in that second circle. We call that the middle circle. And then that third circle is the outer circle, which usually is comprised of weaker ties, but still people are close and important that they ended up being nominated and named in the person's social network. You can add all three of these to what's a measure of total network size. So when we're thinking about the quantity measure, the structural aspect, this is a measure of structure. It's the total network size, the total size of the person's social convoy. But all four could be conceived of as different types of measures of the social convoy. We've used them in different ways, where some work has delved into how does that in particular, that size of that inner circle matter for a person's health and well-being? Or how does that outer circle tie, those weak ties matter? And there's been a lot of work on both of those, but not as much research on that middle circle. But we have some colleagues who are working with us that are thinking about, well, is it that middle circle where kind of some unique things are happening? So some work is being done on that. And a side anecdote about that middle circle, I'll make in LCD, we were working the life course development program. We were working with a colleague who had some data from military members. And we asked people to map their social convoys, and many of them, included their former or their military colleagues, former people they were serving with currently, and in their networks, and they were predominantly nominated in their middle circle. So their inner circle might have looked like a representative sample population of the general population, where it included maybe a spouse, partner, a child, a parent, etc. Their middle circles were pretty different composition-wise than would be a general sample population. So were included more work colleagues, and in particular, the people they were serving within the military. Whereas in a general population study, we might see work colleagues or colleagues, et cetera, in the outer circle. So an interesting demonstration of how context does matter for the composition of the social networks. So again, that second part, once you've done that nomination of people in the social network, the name generation part, so people you feel close and important to. So moving on to then detailing, asking specific questions about the people who are nominated. And some measures of convoy structure that we've used where we've asked specific questions on, in addition to size, is geographic proximity. So for example, you might go through and ask, does so-and-so, that person number one you mentioned, do they live within an hour's drive of you? And then you would either say yes or no. And then the contact frequency, how often are you in contact with person one, Jane, for example? And we'd ask that on a 5-point Likert scale. And then in terms of composition, we'd say that person number one you nominated, how old are they? What is their gender? And then what is their relationship to you? And then we'd offer some categories, or they can nominate it, or they can mention it on their own. They could say, well, that's my child, for example. So a couple of strategies or notes with that information. So you could administer that second part, that step 2 of collecting those detailed characteristics of each of the individuals nominated in 2 different ways. We've predominantly done it this first way in that first bullet point, which is we collect it by person. So we go through and we start off with Jane, for example, or that person number 1, then go to person number 2. So we start off with person number 1, we go through all the variables that we want to know about that person. So their geographic proximity, their contact frequency, their age, their gender, there's a whole host of other variables we ask as well. And then once you do that, you then move to the second person, the third, etc. An alternative way that you could do this is to collect it by measure. So you could say, for example, start off with proximity and go through, start off at person number 1. Do they live within an hour's drive of you? Yes or no. Person number 2. Do they live within an hour's drive? Yes or no. And then et cetera. Then when you're done with all the network members nominated, then you then pivot and then go to the next concept. That's an alternative way that could be done, but we've had most experience and success doing it with that first way, but just wanted to raise that. It could have an implication on survey administration time and burden, depending on that. And I think that could be an interesting methodological question in the future about, do you get interesting or different types of data depending on how that's incorporated or gone through with the different types of measures. Another strategy note is that I've been alluding to that you can really adapt the measures. Really what we're giving here is examples and examples that we've included in our work. So for example, that geographic proximity measure, it does not have to be like, does the person live within an hour's drive of you? That was developed by Tony when the study was launched because it was a regionally representative sample of the Detroit metro area, so the 3 counties. So that 1 hour drive really made sense to fit the context of the region and geography. But if it's another geography, for example, we've done work on collected data in Lebanon, which is a smaller country, where we asked it, does your network persons live in Lebanon, in the country, outside the country, et cetera. So you really need to think about what is that geographic proximity scale that is really important or fits the context of your study and your study population. And then contact frequency. So we predominantly ask this generally, and so people could in the main study, and so people could think about it. It could be any type of contact, and you could tailor your question to think about the modes of contact. And you're going to hear about this a little bit later on in much more detail. If you think about, for example, how your contact frequency might vary with the same person, but by different modes of communication. So I won't say any more on this and more to come. And also that you might limit and change the number of people to follow up on. So a note that in the study that we do cap the number of people we ask about, just to limit the amount of survey burden on a person that you can ask in a reasonable amount of survey, because there is a large variation in how many people that people have that they feel close and important to, or how they interpret that question. So for example, with those circles, when we ask people to nominate people into their inner circle, middle, and outer, we cap that at 20 people. So they can't nominate more than 20 people per circle. And we do have some networks in our data where people do have up to 60 people. So they might have kept going and people had even more. And then in terms of those detailed follow-up questions, where we ask about the structure, et cetera, we cap that at 10, just for to limit the amount of survey burden and time. And still, that often, this could be a 15-minute chunk part of a survey. And when you need to collect other information like health outcomes, other experiences, et cetera, that is quite a sizable amount of time. But if, say, you want to include this measure of social relations in your study, but you don't quite have that amount of time, you can down adjust that number to be even lower. Like, for example, a number that I've seen in a lot of studies out there, such as the National Health and Aging Trend Study, is they cap that number at 5. And also the General Social Survey, the GSS, does cap it at 5 as well when they included a measure of social relations. But we think in the studies that we've done, given our particular focus and emphasis on social relations, that number, we measured detailed characteristics on up to 10 individuals in the social networks, which we think is important and unique, because then you're going to bring in more of that data on those weaker ties that you might not get if you have that lower number of social network members that you follow up on. So an important trade-off you need to think about when determining that number of people that are nominated and how you follow up on that. All right, so you hopefully are not getting bored from hearing me talk, but we're going to pause now and ask you to do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of work in applying some of this, but applying it in your own life and thinking about your own social network. And we'll ask some of you to share if you'd like about what you're found in terms of your network. But if you don't feel like sharing, because it is a personal subjective experience, as we noted earlier, but if anybody would like to share or any insights or questions as you're doing this, we do welcome that. And there'll be a little time at the end of this exercise to hear from you all. So I'm hoping you all could find a piece of paper nearby you, which might be difficult in our electronic world, but hopefully you have a piece of paper nearby and a pen or paper. And if not,
If
hopefully
you
you can.
don't have a piece of paper, and maybe you have a second screen you could use.
Yep, you can do this electronically as well. So I'll give you a second if you need to round up a piece of paper and a paper or pencil. All right, so the first thing if you could do on that piece of paper is if you could draw a set of just like we call it the bullseye sometimes, or the set of concentric circles. So first draw a little circle and then write the word me in it, as in you, in the middle. And then draw a set of three more circles around that, so it looks exactly like what you're seeing on the screen here. Okay. And just a side note, before we get into as if we were pretending and administering this in the survey context or an interview. So these characterizations in the diagram, we don't typically show the respondent those. Those are really for you all as workshop attendees, because that's more of the concept labeling, like the inner circle, the middle circle, the outer circle. We don't use those words or that verbiage when characterizing this or talking about it with the respondents. That's how I want to map that back to some of the concepts that we were laying earlier. But in the text that I'm going to read to you, that's more of the language that we use when administering this in a survey or interview setting. So now I'm going to transition from pretending as if I was interviewing one of you or interviewing you in a one-on-one or a face-to-face context. So beginning with the people that you feel closest to, is there any one person or persons that you feel so close to that it's hard to imagine life without them? If you could take a second to think about that, and then if you could write their first name along with the number that you are entering them into your diagram. And if you could enter them into your inner circle. So actually, there's a small caveat to where we do say that inner circle, so to help characterize it that way, to guide people about where to put those individuals. So let's pause right now. We'll give people a minute or two to think about those people are so close and important that it's hard to imagine life without them. Write their name and the number that you're coming up with them and you're entering them into your diagram. So for example, number 1 would be your first person, number 2, number 3, etc. I'll give another like 30 seconds or so for you to wrap up thinking and entering those closest people into your network diagram. Okay, so now we're gonna move on. So next, I'd like you to think about other people who you may not feel quite that close to, but who are still very important to you. So write those people's name and the number that you're entering them into that middle circle. I'll give a couple minutes to think about this group and enter them into your diagram. And just a side methodological note that if we were doing this in the midst of a telephone interview or face-to-face interview, I would ask you to tell me those people's names and I would be entering them into a computer-assisted interview. But since we don't want to put you on the spot, we're asking you to put it on your own paper. All right, maybe we'll give another 30 seconds or so to finish up those name nominations into your middle circle. Okay, we're gonna move on to the last part. So lastly, are there people whom you haven't already listed into your diagram, but who are close and important enough in your life that they should also be placed into your diagram? So if you could think about who those people might be and then write their names as well as the number that you're entering them into your outer circle of that. And again, I'll give a couple minutes for this group. All right, so we have a few more seconds. So if you could begin to wrap up, even if it's not quite complete, hopefully the approach has still been become a little bit more concrete. Okay, so we're going to now move to the next stage. So this is the first step that I talked about earlier, which is the name generation. So you populated your personal social convoy. So the second part, so if you could draw the best you can on your piece of paper, or flip the piece of paper over, or get a second piece, and if you could draw a table that has 4 columns, and in total 6 rows. And again, a methodological note, so this is not actually a step that we ask people to go through. This is all built into a computer-assisted telephone interview, or a face-to-face interview would be programmed into an instrument. But this is hopefully this approach will ingrain with you the approach we used and the measures that are incorporated into it. So, and then and right at the top, include these measures. So that the person, you can just put number at the far left column. Second column, put age. This next one, you could put live within an hour's drive, yes or no. And then that fourth far right column, if you could just put family member, yes or no. And then once you have your table set up, then if you could, and again, I guess you could do this electronically too. That's how I make all my tables. But if you could then write that information in for the first people. So look back at your diagram and fill that information for those first 5 people that you nominated. I'm not going to ask you to do this for 10 like we do in our study. But if you could write that information, so starting with that first person you nominated in your convoy, you put that number 1. How old are they? And then ask yourself, does that person number 1, do they live within an hour's drive? And then put a yes or a no. And then ask yourself, is that person number 1, are they a family member? And for the purposes of this illustration, I'm defining that broadly. It could be immediate, extended family, et cetera. But in our studies, we had some much more specificity to this. So it could be where we get the specific relationship. But purpose of illustration to say, are they an immediate or extended family member? Yes or no? And then if you could move forward and then consult your personal diagram and do that for people 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'll pause and give everyone about 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to do that. Then I'll have some follow-up questions afterwards and ask if anybody would like to share. How's everybody doing? Does anybody need any more time? Is more time or all done? Okay. Well, let's move on. So now I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask you to do some calculations. And this is going to ask you to refer to both your diagram. So that's where you did your name generation, where you populated your convoy, as well as consulting this table. So the first question I want to ask you is, how many people total did you include in your diagram? So if you could count or refer to it, and if you numbered them all the way through, then that should be the last number of your last person that you nominated in your outer circle. I don't know if anyone feels comfortable in either putting in the chat how many people you ended up including for practice sake, and again, not to put anybody on the spot, but if anybody wants to share. We got 11, thank you. Thank you, Brady. So yeah, already we see some variation. So that's what we see in our studies too. Okay, the second question I want you to calculate or look at and consult your diagram is, I want to ask you to create a percentage variable or a proportion. So in other words, the measure is what proportion of your social convoy is comprised of weaker ties or comprised of people in the outer circle. So to calculate this, I want to ask you to first count the total number of people that you put in that third circle, so that outer circle. Count that number and write it down. Then if you could take that number and divide it by that number from that first question I asked you, which is a measure of your total network size. So again, you're dividing that total number of people in that outer circle by the total number of people in the whole diagram. And then if you can multiply that by 100, that'll give you a measure of what percentage of your network is comprised of people in the outer circle. Or another way we describe that as a measure in conceptual language is the proportion of your network that is comprised of weak ties or weaker ties. And if anybody wants to share what proportion of your network is comprised of those outer circle weaker ties. Thank you, Sung-hee, 23%. Thank you, Anya, 27. And an interesting aside, so some new research is coming about the importance and benefit of both having ties in the inner and the outer circle, where that they have different functions. In particular, as we think about older adults, I'm giving a focus on aging in this workshop in particular, where the inner circle ties provide a certain type of hands-on care, which has been linked with functional health outcomes, whereas we're seeing with these outer circle ties, we're seeing a more stronger link with cognitive health outcomes and stimulation cognitively. So both sets of ties are important and have been demonstrated to have unique impacts on health outcomes. But as I mentioned, we have some colleagues that are delving into that particular interesting group in the middle, that middle circle. So thank you everyone for sharing. Yeah, again, some nice variation in terms of the proportion of your networks that are comprised of those weaker ties. So the third question or calculation I want to ask you to do is now to consult that table I asked you to fill out. So the question I want to ask you to calculate or determine is, what is the age range? So what is the minimum up to the maximum ages of people in your first 5 networks? So I'd say closest, but again, I don't want to just be those first in your first 5, what's the age range of those first 5 people in your network? And of course, it's okay if it spans your inner to middle, et cetera, depending on wherever you put those first 5. But what is the age range of those first 5 people? Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for sharing and going through that exercise. Yeah, again, some quite variation, again, highlighting the lifespan nature of our social relations. So just again, to link this back to the concepts, so that first measure I asked you to calculate, or that first calculation, again, the total number of people in your diagram. So that is what's called in the literature, that's network size. That's a measure of that. The quantity, it's a measure of structure, of thing when you think about the characteristics, the built aspects of your convoy. And that second measure also is a measure of size, it's sort of a measure of composition as well, because it's thinking about the portion of it that is represented based on closeness. The third measure of age, so that's a compositional measure, also a part of structure. So just to highlight some of these examples that I've been talking about earlier in the abstract. So now I want to pause and see if anyone has any questions about the measure, or any reflections that you want to share as you've been doing this personally. You don't have to share your personal experience necessarily, but it could be some methodological insights or questions you've had from doing it personally.
Yeah, no, I had a couple, and then there's another one that just came up in the chat. So,
Mhm.
has there been any research on that number of follow-up? I'm presuming by follow-up questions you mean populating the table, or maybe you meant the follow-up questions about size. But has there been any research, demonstrating that if you ask 10 follow-up questions or 15 follow-up questions, or you ask about 10 people or whatever, that people record that the perceived burden of the survey is much worse? So you said, like, the lower the number of follow-up questions, the better for minimizing burden. But have there actually been demonstrations of that empirically?
That's a really good question. So I think I don't, we haven't done it systematically, unless Christine, Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know we like observed through pre-testing, and Brady, that's a good clarification question about did we mean, so typically what I meant when I said that was like changing the number of people that you ask the follow-up questions
Okay.
on, but there is going to be a direct relationship with how many questions you ask about each of those individuals, because we usually ask about 5 or 6 questions about each of those individuals, like the age, gender, their geographic proximity, contact frequency, how many years known. More recently, we've been adding education about those network members. I'll have a slide or two on that. So actually, that's up to 7. You can add other ones like the race, ethnicity of the person, the religious affiliation. You can go on and add a whole bunch of other questions, but again, that's going to be proportional to the amount of time overall that it takes to get through
Right.
this battery of questions. I think, and we've learned over time where we've had to drop some of the follow-up questions about individuals to get that time into a more reasonable time frame. But Tony or Christine, do you have any recollections about any systematic or anecdotal learning from doing pre-tests about burden on this measure?
I, I I'll say one thing, and I'm sure Tony has more to add, but I will say in our most recent data collection efforts, we had 2 large studies that just got out of the field. Anecdotally, the interviewers were reporting back that respondents felt there was too many people being asked about. So we had agreed to actually reduce our number from 10 to 8 as a way to kind of address some of that. But we wanted, as Noah mentioned, it's such a rich, I guess, resource for really understanding people's social networks. We didn't want to decrease it too much, but we also didn't want the individuals who we were interviewing to feel like too burdened. So we tried to do a little bit of a compromise, but I don't know of any empirical studies that have examined that. Tony, I don't know if you know of
I mean, the
anything.
systematic studies, just like you say, anecdotal evidence where
Hmm.
one thing I would recommend everybody do, any study you do, try the measures out yourself, give the interviews. I've done this myself, and you often learn things, and sometimes there are things you don't even know to ask the question. So doing this, there are a couple of times when you just knew, even if the person gave you the answer, you were reaching the end of their patience, their limits, whatever. And as a result, the quality of the data start to decline. So you have to be sensitive to that.
Yep, for sure. Okay, cool. Thanks. Joyce asked the question. I know you mentioned this a bit. Has a question about closeness through virtual contact, like Zoom, WhatsApp, etc., been added? Thought of this as some people I listed in the exercise do not live close, but are close virtually.
That's a really good question, and maybe actually if we could hold off on that for a little bit, because the second half of our workshop will be delving into, in particular, thinking about internet communication technologies and some modifications that have been done to the measure over time to get at that a little bit. So, uh,
Cool.
Joyce, if you're okay with us holding off for that, with more information to come out of.
Okay. Usha says, I'm curious if this framework allows your deceased loved ones to be placed in your social convoy.
So the short answer is yes. And actually we've learned, and so wave 1 of the study was done through in-person, face-to-face interviews where people had in front of them the hard copy of those concentric circles, and they were physically asked to write in, like you all were doing, their networks, and then over time, then it became a telephone interview where the interviewer was doing it. But people actually, we were reviewing some of these, and Tony, led that study. So as you know, that people included in those personal diagrams, we have the hard copies still. Yeah, they did include deceased persons. And related, since this goes back to saying that this is a subjective process and phenomenon, like you could, if you're, as the investigator, you wanted to only have it be living persons, you could put that restriction on it, but we haven't in those characterizations and those prompts that have been used. And maybe related, but it's not directly that question you're asking, but people have also included pets in their convoys of social relations.
My very favorite was a boa constrictor. Doesn't come up often, but it did come up once. And everybody kept on saying, what? Like we thought we misheard, but no, there was a boa constrictor. More practically though, you might want to consider what age. So for the in-person interviews, we just made the determination that we only wanted people to include people 13 years of age or older. It was a kind of an approximation of adulthood. I mean, we just were going for adult kind of relationships. So we thought, obviously, if you had a baby or a small child or a toddler, they might be very, very close. But the nature of that relationship wasn't the kind of relationships we were looking for in the study. So we eliminated that, but we picked 13 because I don't know why. We had, at the time, it was generally considered the age of reason or ability to think abstractly about stuff. So we thought we'd get decent answers.
And I know, Tony, with the earlier study that preceded the longitudinal study of social relations that launched in 1992, but the social supports of the elderly study that you and Bob Kahn led, I think that cutoff of people, social network members that you asked detailed follow-up questions was 18. So then I know then you dropped it then lower to 13 in the longitudinal study of social relations. So
Great. That's all the chat questions I see right now. So yep.
And one other note about that. So, and also we have observed that people have also nominated into their social networks religious figures. So such as some people nominated God into their networks and things like that. So people do include things beyond might be actual like specific people.
Yeah.
So
another time another thing we had to kind of figure out how to deal with this. We had a clergy, and he couldn't narrow it down. So he wanted his whole parish or congregation or whatever it was to be included. That was a little dicey, but he didn't have the name, so we just went for a one size fits one nomination. But that doesn't, that didn't really meet the spirit of the measure, but we couldn't talk him out of it.
and that was probably the person that maxed out on the circle sizes and had that top value in social network size. So, and they would have kept going.
Yeah.
All right, so any last reflections or thoughts or questions people might have about that, either that experience personally or methodologically as you thought about and going through it with your own life? Well, if you think of them later, please feel free to put them in the chat or bring them up at another point in time for the question and answer. But thank you all for going through that exercise, and hopefully I kind of illustrated more concretely the concepts and then the specific steps involved in administering, again, what's called the hierarchical mapping technique.
Noah, maybe someone had their hand up. Anya, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I don't know if we are running out of time, that's fine, but I think it was interesting that I never thought of doing it for my own self. I think I have a greater appreciation of depth of what involves in it. So out of that comes like when we talk about closeness versus confidant, and if I can give you two examples, like for example, somebody maybe they are having a cancer diagnosis, or they are on the precipice of wanting to move to a long-term care. So maybe I might recruit somebody who's going to a similar experience. So I cannot imagine my life going through that without that person, but that's a very transient relationship perhaps. And also, for example, for a lot of queer people, in terms of closeness, I think I may not be close to my natal family, but I think I somehow feel obligated to name them in my close in the inner circle. But also, and you know, in fact, the closest, the more salient, meaningful, I'm still putting them on the periphery or in the middle circle. And also, it's interesting because I mapped it on a piece of paper. I felt like the smaller circle has the least amount of space, but I want, maybe if there was more real estate there, I would probably put more weaker ties probably. So it's interesting, and you know, and that's why the cutoff, I think it might be problematic in term because I have these so many more that I can perhaps nominate. And I was wondering if a random, say if somebody names 30 people, like randomly selecting 5 and asking them of the extensive network characteristic questions, do you think that might be a better option than cutting off to 8 or 10 or 5?
I think I would suggest that what we want to communicate is that this is not written in stone. This is what we've done. It met our needs and our interests at the time. We have done other studies. Sometimes we allow more, sometimes we allow less. Sometimes we get a lot more detail. Sometimes we get less detail. We don't pretend that this is the only way to go about this. We just try to match it to what our needs are at the time. And I think everybody should do that. I mean, what this gives you that I think we're particularly proud of, it gives you a neutral way of allowing people to nominate their network, but it doesn't give them a criteria. I mean, back when we were starting this, most people would say like, start with relationships, your parents, your spouse, your children, but we didn't do that. So yeah, most people named their spouse, children, and parents, but not everybody did. So we wanted people to be proactive about naming who they name. Now, if you have different goals, you might change the STEM. So like if you're doing a study on a special population, maybe you want to know about how people who have a particular disease cope with that disease. You might say to them, how many people do you know who have that disease? Or, live in a certain special circumstance. Then you don't really, I don't want to say you don't care, but I will say you don't care so much about everybody they know or everybody in the network, but you're really zeroing in on a specific issue. It's not the only important issue in the world. It may not even be an important issue in the world, but it's an important issue for the current moment. And that's what you want to hear about. So you should feel free to kind of adapt it to your needs. Maybe you want a study of all women or, all men or all people with education. I mean, that's not what I would do, but I can imagine a circumstance where that's what the study is about.
I just wanted to follow up and say, thank you, Anya, for those insights and sharing your reflections on doing this, both from a methodological perspective. And you kind of captured nicely, and as Tony mentioned, you can adapt that STEM. So like, for example, there's a lot of studies out there, they measure what's called a confidant network. So you would ask people to nominate people that they talk to about important matters. So that's what's guiding it, rather than thinking about people to nominate people who are based on levels of closeness in their life. And as you noted, that could result in really different people being populated and named in that network. So as Tony mentioned, yeah, it's really driven by your research question to determine which STEM or STEMs, or if this is the right measurement approach for you and your question, and so how you can adapt it and change it to your specific study goals as well as study population. And one thing I wanted to revisit too is a really interesting idea you mentioned about doing a random selection of, like, say, for example, you do the network map where people could have up to 60 people based on how we did it. You could not put a cap on it in your administration of a future version of this. We've talked about, yeah, how it would be interesting if you did a random selection of the people that are in that map, which might help with that problem of kind of, because it does put a bias or a focus on that inner circle. So for example, if a person has a very large inner circle and you only ask about the first 10, you're going to mostly get those inner circle, those very close ties. But for those people who have maybe 1 or 2 people in the inner circle, you're capturing more of that outer circle. So you're getting a little bit of a different story for different people, which is okay if that's the goal. And oftentimes it has been to understand that subjective nature of the experience due to, as we mentioned, the constraints of survey time. We could only ask about so many people, but that's a really interesting idea. We have talked about that a little bit, maybe in a future iteration, we talked about doing a random selection of the network members instead of going in a linear order from which they're nominated. So thanks for mentioning that.
I just wanted to jump in real quick and just say we actually currently have a study in collecting data on among a sample of queer adults ages 18 into their 70s, looking at their social networks with a focus, understanding that, you know, chosen family is in particular quite important to this population. And also to bring up another population that you mentioned, we have there's another one that we're collecting data on right now, another group, it's cancer patients, and looking at their social networks, and also focusing, not to get so specific, but on their pets, and going through different treatments for cancer and the importance of, you know, their pets during that process. And again, as you said, some of these relationships can be kind of transient, you know, and what we're seeing is people saying, like, when I was doing chemo and I could not get out of bed, and, you know, that dog laid right next to me and asked me for nothing and was a, you know, constant support. And I couldn't have gotten through it without them, right? So, you know, I think to highlight what Noah has said before, you know, context is sort of crucial here, and, you know, asking the follow-up questions, you know, might not be able to get everything in a survey always, but, you know, with interviews, with different types of methods for data collection, you can really start to dig into, you know, what makes a relationship crucial to somebody at a given point in time. So great. I just thought it was great that you brought both of those up because we are looking at it.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you everyone for engaging on that with that exercise. So now I'm going to move on. So really that has been the quantitative part, the measuring, and documenting the structure and composition of the social network. So a few notes on relationship quality, which we've talked about in the Convoy model section. So with relationship quality, as I noted before, there's separate measures available for both the positive aspects of relationship quality as well as the negative. And again, a note I made before was that these are not viewed and conceptualized, nor have the psychometric properties, that they're not opposite ends of the same scale or the same concept, but they're really unique measures where you can have both high and low positive relationship quality and high and low negative relationship quality. So here's some examples of items that we've used to measure these and have been shown to have good psychometric properties. And again, they're not exhaustive. There's others in the literature and the others that others have used and based on other theories that are based on similar concepts. But how we use this, administer it in the context of our studies and surveys, are we ask people to agree on a 5-point Likert scale with the following statements. And a note I want to make about this is that you could do this 2 different ways. And we predominantly done this based on the relationship. So for example, we go through each of these items for your mother, that so she supports me. I enjoy spending time with my mother. And then do it for the father, a spouse partner, an adult child, if you have one, that you rely on most, a friend, etc. So these were specific relationships that were identified for the particular study that were noted and why this information wanted to be got from. And Tony, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about why those relationships were chosen versus others, or.
They were the ones that people mentioned most frequently. But again, this is not written in stone. If you have a different priorities, you should feel comfortable adapting the measure. So if you only want non-biologically related or only non-relatives or only step families, you know, you match it to your needs. There's nothing here written in stone. This is meant as a kind of skeleton, a framework for asking the questions you need to ask.
And a related thing that we've seen in some of the data, it doesn't, and predominantly happens to where these individuals, those relationships I mentioned that we ask these questions for, are in that network map. But there are cases where the person doesn't feel close to one of these relationships and they're not in the network diagram, but they do, there is a level of positive or less so positive or more negative, less negative, that it's important to know that as well. So
I mean, think about it yourself. think of all the people you know who are married. Are all all those relationships the same? Are they all equally high quality? Are they all equally close? Are they all completely positive or completely negative? I mean, there's a lot of variation out there in human relations, and we're trying to do our best to pick it up without making a judgment about what's the most important or what's the best.
And to that point, so in one study we did where we changed how these relationship quality items were asked, that is, instead of doing it by relationship, so instead of doing it by these key relationships that we just mentioned, we did it by the number that the person was nominated. So we did it for the first 3 people nominated in the network. We asked these quality questions, the positive ones and the negative ones. So it's just another way of collecting these data. Again, as Tony mentioned, it's not written in stone, and you can determine which the best approach to meet your study needs and your research questions. But in these 5 here are the ones that we've used and have found that it worked pretty well, and they work together nicely psychometrically. And often what we do is then we create a mean composite scale of these 5 items to measure the relationship quality. You could do it both for that specific relationship, or we've also then averaged the average to create an overall measure of positive relationship quality for that person across these relationships. So in terms of negative, we use that following similar stem, so asking people their level of agreement with a set of statements about the person, if you're doing a relationship, or the order that they nominated the person. So we found that these items seem to get the most variation. A couple of the other ones were added which did not operate as well or had even less variation than these. So for example, you might say, so-and-so gets on my nerves, or so-and-so makes too many demands of me. And as I mentioned before, we used that in that interesting study on the longevity and found that this measure in particular had an interesting association with longevity outcomes.
But I'll add one thing that we learned practically. So we weren't getting enough variation asking positives, so we wanted to ask negatives. But we also found that we couldn't just ask negatives. We had to allow people to be positive too. So we would ask positives and then we would ask negatives. So you didn't want to have a person saying, you know, my mother, my spouse, my kid gets on my nerves. They were uncomfortable or make too many demands. They were uncomfortable doing that. But if you first allowed them to say, you know, this person cares for me, this person would help me if I had a problem, this person would lend me money, then they had the positives down. So then they could be a little bit more forthcoming about the negatives.
And just to add to that, people usually chuckle after they say all the positive and you mention the nerves and the demands, they start laughing a little bit, but they feel comfortable, like Tony said, reporting about it because they had the opportunity to be positive.
It's not that I hate my mother, but she does get on my nerves. You know, it's not that I hate, etc. We won't ask everybody to take a test on that one, but I'm sure everybody can relate.
So on this slide, we already talked about it and mentioned it, that again, you can measure this. You can administer the relationship quality questions, and this is an example of 2 different ways. So again, by relationship, making sure that you cover all the key relationships you want to focus on in your study, or by order nominated in the network. And as I mentioned, there's likely some overlap among those ways of doing it, but not all. So a couple of additional notes on the adaptability of the measure and tailoring it to your needs, your study population, as well as your research question. As we've been talking about and has been mentioned earlier on, that you can change the STEM to focus on nomination of additional types of networks. So as I mentioned, the measure it stems from the Convoy model, which talks about closeness and the hierarchical nature of our social relations, how they vary based on our subjective assessment of their closeness. But then there's other types of networks we've talked about, like confidant networks. But you could also ask people to characterize other types of networks, like Tony mentioned and Jess mentioned. Like, for example, if you want to understand a person's positive caregiving support network, I know there's some caregiving researchers joining us here today. Like, you could characterize it that way. And I give a citation of some work that Tony and I did with Carrie Sherman, where she assessed the general social relations convoys of a set of remarried caregivers, but then asked tailored the convoy measure, the hierarchical mapping technique measure, to understand specifically their positive caregiving support network. So who they were getting positive support from specifically for providing caregiving. And then she also then administered it again a 3rd time to understand the negative caregiving support network, asking a set of different questions and stems to understand who is in that. And then interestingly, she then looked at the overlap or uniqueness across those three different unique networks. And there was a fair amount of overlap, but not all. So some people were showing up uniquely, for example, in the negative caregiving network. So just to give a couple of anecdotes from that study and that paper. Another way you could adapt it is to remove composition questions. So stemming from Brady, your question about the burden, and you really need to think about, are the questions you're asking about and detailing the social network members relevant to your study, and then paring them down or adding more based on your study needs. Like for example, some ones that we haven't always included, but we've included maybe in some smaller studies that we've administered, is the race ethnicity of the convoy measures, which has provided some interesting insights about homophily of social networks along racial and ethnic dimensions. Also, the religious affiliation of our convoy members. Is it similar or different? What's the extent of that in our social networks? And also a measure that was added newly in the wave 2 of the longitudinal social relations study has been subsequently added in waves 3 and 4, which wave 4, which was just recently completed, is the education of the social network measures, which gives a unique perspective on the education that is available to people. And one that I'm just going to give a brief example on after this is a measure about asking whether or not each of those people that was nominated lives in the same housing community as the respondent that we're interviewing. So next I'm going to highlight a couple of examples, and I'll move them kind of briefly so that we can get to the break and then move on to the next stage. But the intent in showing you these examples is both with this next one is to show you the adaptability of the measure, but also just to show you in practice and application these measures and these concepts in some of our recent work. So as I mentioned, in one study, we adapted the convoy measure to understand how the specific people nominated in the social network lived within a person's housing community. So the study population we were looking at was older adults. So these were lower income older adults who are living in what's called subsidized senior housing communities. And just showing you a couple of pictures of here, how they might vary architecturally. And so these, again, are HUD subsidized communities for older adults who are usually above the age of 62 or older. And real briefly, the study sample. So this, we did some interviews in local to Ann Arbor, Michigan community. And the community had 205 units. So it was considered what's a high-rise apartment building. There was 250 residents that lived in this building. And there was 2 common entrances that people could come and go to, and there was a locked building. And we were able to interview, we invited the whole community to participate in our survey. We were doing face-to-face interviews. And we got about 20% that agreed to participate. So about 50 of the residents agreed to participate in our interview. And real briefly, those are our demographic characteristics. I won't go into detail on those. But we added a measure so we mapped the general social convoys where we went through those steps that we went through with you all, where we asked people to think about people who are so close and important they could not imagine life without. So the inner circle nominations, then we did the middle circle nominations and the third circle. And then after we did that, we asked some of the usual questions about their social convoy, the characteristics of each of those individuals. But then the last question we asked at the end of that set for each of the individuals was, does this person live in the community? So live in this housing community, yes or no? So that allowed us to get to calculate a new or unique measure that was specific to this population, which was what proportion of their social convoy lives in their housing community, which we thought was important to understand the social support available to this unique housing population of older adults, who in some ways are more vulnerable given the lower income status. So as you can see here, the descriptives from this examination where on average, people had 12.5 people in their general social convoy, and the range from some had none. Some people had no people that they felt close and important to, all the way up to 29 across those 3 circles. So then that next line is, what was the number of people who, where they said, yes, they live in this housing community. And on average, that was about 3 people in their social convoys lived in that housing community. And it ranged from 0 all the way up to 17 of people in their close social network lived in the housing community. And then when we proportionalize that, about 27%, on average, about 27% of the social networks were comprised of fellow residents living in the community. So again, understanding that many of the other people, so as you see overall, they had on average 12 people in their network. So many of the people who they feel close and important to do not live in the building. So that could be maybe adult children, friends who live in other communities, etc. But this gave us an understanding of the extent to which people might be isolated or not in these physical structures of this housing community. And as we mentioned, you may have seen in the abstract for this workshop, we did mention that we would touch briefly on this other measurement approach that is used for understanding social networks. So we've been spending a lot of time having you go through and understand the egocentric approach, which the hierarchical mapping technique, again, is a subtype of measure of the egocentric social network measurement approach. But there is another approach out there. Again, we're not going to go into detail on that, but I just did want to give a brief mention and showing of an example of that. And it's called the sociocentric approach. And a theory that is often used in the study of sociocentric social networks is social contagion theory. And this has been popularized in recent work by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler. And you may have seen and read some of this work in particular where they show that or argue that behaviors are contagious, just as so might be an infectious disease such as COVID or the flu. And that it argues that people's behaviors spread through our social ties via multiple mechanisms. And listed here are 3 types of those mechanisms through which our behaviors might spread through our social connections. One is induction effects, whereas we might engage in a behavior that others in our social network do because of the prestige or the influence that people in our networks have. So if we think about why certain celebrities or influencers are given certain products and things like that, it's because it's the thinking that others in their network or that they have ties with, either less so or more strong ties, might go out and buy that product or that thing because that person has a certain level of prestige or importance in the network. So that's the one mechanism. The other is proximity effects, that because we share similar environmental characteristics or live geographically close to some people, we might be exposed to certain things, like if we live by a park and our neighbors live by a park, we might have shared or similar behaviors. Another is this concept of homophily, of shared characteristics, or arguing that people associate with people who have similar characteristics and as a result then engage in similar behaviors. And this concept of social contagion and social contagion theory has been linked to a whole host of health behaviors. And one of the most well-known ones has been the study of obesity using the Framingham Heart Study data that Christakis and Fowler led. But then they've extended this, and other researchers have extended this to other behaviors such as smoking, happiness, loneliness, etc., and how that spreads through a social network. So in that study, I mentioned briefly where we administered the hierarchical mapping technique to understand the egocentric perspective of the social networks in these housing communities. We also administered a sociocentric measure. So I think this highlights to you that even within the same study population, you can administer both approaches. You can get an egocentric approach, an understanding of subjectively from all the individuals that we are able to interview who they perceive that they're close and important to. That gave us one set of perspective and set of data to understand. But then we also wanted to understand this from the sociocentric approach. So understanding that the closeness approach didn't give us a perspective on all the interactions that were happening in this community, because there might be some chance interactions that don't rise to that level of closeness that they didn't end up to be populated, but they might have an interaction that might be influential for these older adults living in this senior housing community. So what we did was, and it is a rough attempt at showing the apartment building and all the different connections you could map between the individuals in the building. So in the context of the interview, we asked the residents to identify the names. So this was done after we did their social convoys, again, based on closeness, where we then asked the residents to identify names of people that they know in the community. So our stem for this was, in other words, if they passed by us here in the hallway, you could tell me their name. So then we asked them to list all the names of the people that they knew in the community. And then we then also showed them a list for recall purposes. Said, all right, now that you gave me that list, is there anybody else from this list of people here in the community that you want to nominate or that you know in the community as a way of? And it was interesting that some people then said, no, I already covered all the people that I know. But some people said, oh, yeah, I forgot to mention so and so here. I see their name here, and I do know them. So then they added a couple of people based on that, but not everybody. So then from that list, we then followed up with a number of questions. So for each of the people they said they know, we said, how much do you respect each of those individuals to help us get that measure of induction? And then how much time do you spend with each of those individuals that you said you know? And then how much do you talk about each of those individuals about important matters? And then we also wanted a measure of negativity. So we asked that nerves question. So each of those people that you listed as knowing here in the community, how much do they get on your nerves? And briefly, here's the descriptives from looking at that and measuring it with this group of 46 residents, the sociocentric approach. So on average, people said they knew 10 other residents in the building, in the community. But then of those people that we interviewed, there's also a measure of how many of those people we interviewed said they knew one of the other respondents, and that was on average 3. But there's a limitation to this. So in the sociocentric literature, it's important that people often say you need a response rate of about 90% in a network to get a full, accurate view of the entire network, which is really difficult to do in this context and community. And as acknowledgingly so, our response rate was much lower. It was 20%. So we do have a bit of a sense where that number of who's saying that they know the other residents is not a full perspective of the whole community. It's really, we're getting a neighborhood in the community of people who know each other, and it's not the full accurate view. So that if we were to interview the whole population, that number would likely be higher. And then we were then able to calculate the average across those people that you know in the community, how much you respect each of those individuals. And there's a high degree of respect, not a lot of time spent. So again, shows that these are very weak ties to kind of just passerby interactions in the hallway. But then a fair degree of confiding in some folks that they know in the community, and low negativity. So then a couple last slides showing this. So then how can we visualize these ties using the sociocentric approach? And this is what's called a sociogram, or a network depiction of the ties. And shown here are what's called a sociogram of the mutual known ties. By mutual, I mean the person who we're interviewing said they knew that person. And then also when we were able to interview that other person, they were part of our sample, they said they know that person as well. So that's why you see double-headed arrows going to and from each box. So each of the boxes is a resident who participated in our interview. And then you see that it was relatively limited among our respondents. And then we have that group over on the far left who there was no mutual ties among any of them. This is another way to show the similar type of data in community, but it's a little less restrictive. So this is now a sociogram of what's called alter ties. So in other words, who knows you? Who knew that respondent? And you see that now it's not a double-headed arrow. Instead, it's a single arrow going into a box. So each of the boxes, again, are respondents. And this is another respondent saying they knew that particular person. And I circled, just for illustration purposes, those 4 residents who we identified as being high in what's called in-degree centrality. So they had arrows going into them where people said they knew them. So in particular, they happened to be known by more people in the community. And this was part of a larger set of work we're doing on thinking about how we can leverage social ties within these types of communities for intervention research. So this was particularly important for those purposes. We wanted to identify those residents who were known by a lot of other people and who might be our vehicles of change in the community. So now I'm going to pivot and now show a couple of other examples that get to a couple of different levels of analysis that you can use data. So now zooming back and going back, moving back into the egocentric approach in the hierarchical mapping technique data. And then after these couple of examples, we'll take a break, and then we're going to move back into the internet communications technologies portion of the workshop. So highlighted here are at the network level. So I'm going to talk now about ways you can analyze and collect these data at the network level, as well as the network member level. So again, if you're looking at it aggregated across the whole person's network, so some of the measures I asked you to calculate for your whole network. But then there's other approaches you can analyze this in a different lens at the specific level of the individuals in the social network. So shown here are, thinking back to your personal diagram, these would be collected variables. So like if we're doing this in a CADI, computer-assisted telephone interview, these would be measures that we would enter and get from the interview itself. You can see I've shown it here from this is an SPSS output, or from a SPSS variable view. And we have our inner circle size. So if we were going along and we calculated the number of people in the inner circle, that would be entered in the CADI system, the middle, the outer circle, et cetera. The age of that first person in the network, whether or not that first person lives within an hour's drive, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what's shown in the data view, where you see these are, again, the collected data. So we have our respondent ID, our unique individuals, our respondents, our rows, and then the number of people they have in the inner circle size. They might have 3, 4 people in that middle. They have 8 people in that outer circle size, and maybe that first person in their network. So this is reflective of the table that you were doing yourself. So that first person was age 34. Yes, that first person lives within an hour's drive, et cetera. And then you can create a number of computed variables, like I was asking you all to do, which I did not ask you to document or put in your table, but that you would do this after the interviews and once your data are collected. But you could compute a number of different variables to get at the different measures that reflect the convoy model. And listed here are a number of different ones, such as network size, the network number, and I'll go into detail what some of those are. So again, the network size, as I had you all do and count yourselves, and that's a sum count of the total number of people entered in all of those 3 circles, so the inner, the middle, and the outer. And again, as I noted before, we cap it at 20 for each, so that it would be 60 max in the studies that we've done. Then there's another measure that we calculate, and that's what we call the network number, and that's that number that we cap at 10. So again, not everybody has 10. So for that network number that we follow up on, so some people, if they only had 7 people across their whole network, we only ask those detailed questions for 7, so their network number would be 7. But if a person had 11 or more network numbers, that number really is 10 plus. So what that is, but we use that number, that network number, for the denominator for a number of these different computed or calculated variables that measure network structure. Like, for example, network average age, which is the computed mean age of all the network members, and it's for the first 10. So we would divide that by whatever that network number is. So if they had only 7, it's divided by 7. But if they had 10 or more, it's 10. And then you can do that for a number of the different other measures and concepts in there, such as the proximity. So you would sum the count of the number ones across there. So yes, they live within an hour's drive. And then you would get a proportion or percentage of the network that lives within an hour's drive. And then you can do it for the family members as well. So this is just a visual illustration of then what it would look like in the data. So this is the data view with your computed variables. So again, taking this first one, this is our first respondent on row 1. They have 15 people in their network, but so their network number that's used in the calculations is 10 because they get that max number. And their average age of their network is 45.4. Maybe 77.1 of their network is proximate. So that's the 4 number of family, etc. So now a couple of empirical examples I wanted to highlight and uses of these measures in some of our recent work. This is one where a recent study where we looked at the link between neighborhood context and access to social capital, and bringing up that rocket ship model again. So we were in particular looking at situational characteristics. So we were looking at the neighborhood context and how that was influencing specific aspects of convoy structure. And we were looking at how in particular network size was influenced. So the data for this, I'm just going to go over this real briefly, but just so you have a little bit of context, it comes from this study that I've mentioned a few times already, as well as others have as well. It's the longitudinal study of social relations that's based in the Detroit metro area that started off in 1992. And for this particular illustration, we used data from wave 3, which was collected in 2015 with telephone interviews. And we selected the sample to be only those who were age 65 and older for this particular analysis. So our measures of social network structure that we used in this analysis was, first we looked at network size. So we looked at the total number of people nominated. So again, that was across the inner, middle, and outer circles. We also looked at proximity, contact frequency, and composition. So I'm just going to show a couple of select findings again, just to show you an illustration of the use of these measures in some of our analyses. So again, we were looking at how access to different types of things in people's neighborhoods. So it could be social resources, such as the population density, the educational composition of your neighborhood, the age composition of your neighborhood, and then how you perceived your neighborhood in terms of if it was quiet or safe, how that was associated with your network structure. And here we found the first finding was that the age composition of the neighborhood was associated with a measure of inner circle size. So in other words, you as an older adult in this study, since we selected that, if you lived in a neighborhood in which there was a greater proportion of younger people, so people under the age of 18, you reported a smaller inner circle size. So you felt closest to a smaller number of people. That was a smaller, closer knit inner circle. So we also looked at that same association for the middle circle. So we also found a very similar finding. So very similar in size, maybe a little diminished in size. But it was, again, living in a neighborhood where there's a greater proportion of younger people, it was associated with a smaller middle circle size, so fewer people in that middle circle. Lastly, though, when we looked at that weak ties, so thinking about your outer circle diagram, that age composition of the neighborhood did not matter, but it was how safe you perceived your neighborhood. So if you perceived your neighborhood as being more safe, you had more people in your outer circle, which we thought made sense, because maybe you're getting out into your community more, you're interacting more with your neighbors, you're going to parks, maybe other places in your neighborhood. So you may be getting to know more of your people in your neighborhood, and maybe getting to include more of those weak ties into your social network. Okay, so that's one example. So I'm going to zoom out. So that's at the network level where we're looking at people's network in aggregate. So we could also look at another perspective of these same data that we collected is at the network member level. So these would be showing you here again at the variable view, the collected variables from the interview. So we have, for example, the row 1 would be the respondent ID. Also, we would collect the person number, the order in which they were nominated. So we know like they were number 1, their person number 5, 6, etc. Then their age, that person's proximity, whether or not they're family members, etc. This is how these data would look if shown at the network member level. And this is using terminology of like if you're doing a multi-level analysis versus a different type of a non-multi-level, like the long versus the wide format. So before I showed you a wide format when it was more suited for creating those network level aggregated variables, but this would be suited showing the same data, but in a long format. So now each of our rows, again, it pertains to respondent, but it now pertains to a specific network member. So that first, so you see all the ones. So this is respondent number 1, but it's all 10 network members that they nominated, and the data specific to each of those network members. So it just allows for a different type of analysis and a different way to structure your data depending on what your analysis is. So I want to provide a brief example of where we looked at it. We did the analysis at the network member level. This is a paper that Tony, Christine, and myself authored looking at the convoys of social relations across 25 years. And our goal was to look at, there were differences in structure and composition by age of the main respondent, so the ego, the respondent, and the closeness. And we did multi-level analysis to do this, where level 1 was the individual network members, the lowest level, and level 2 was at the level of the respondents, so the ego in this case. And the reason we needed to do the multi-level modeling was because we needed to accommodate that the non-independence of observations. In other words, the network members being nested within the individual respondent networks. And again, we did a multi-level model conducted for each of our outcomes, and we were predicting a number of outcomes of network composition and structure. For example, we looked at network member age, the years known, contact frequency, proximity, etc. And for illustration purposes, I just wanted to highlight one finding, and this is the one for proximity. So again, this was done at the level of predicting whether or not the network member, each network member was proximate, so whether or not they lived within an hour's drive, by the age of the respondent themselves. So we did find that there was an age relationship. There was a significant association between the age of the respondent and the proximity, likelihood of proximity of the network members. And we looked at this using 2 different data sets. I won't go into too much detail on that, but we looked at it over time in these 2 different data sets. Again, with a study that Tony led with Bob in 1980, social supports of the elderly. And then again, this more recent social relations study data collected in 2005. This is wave 2 data. But interestingly, we found that in both data sets, in both cohorts, so older adults, there was a significant greater likelihood that their network members were proximity decreased over time of the network, the likelihood. And there was some cohort differences over time with this. We're seeing a more pronounced relationship between age and proximity in the older cohort, that is from the social supports of the elderly. But again, wanted to highlight this to you. So it's a different way of analyzing it instead of at the aggregated network level where a multi-level model was not included, or you can do it at the level of the network members. Again, it should be driven by your research question and what you're hoping to learn. So another different analysis approaches I wanted to highlight for you all is that different approaches can be used to analyze both the antecedents and outcomes of our social network characteristics, the structure. One is what I've been showing you so far is what's called the variable-centered approaches. So this is where we examine the unique effect of specific social network characteristics like geographic proximity, contact frequency, etc., on an outcome. And like, for example, the prior example I just showed you. A second approach you can use is what's called the person-centered approach. And this is in one subpart of this is the ego, and we're doing this at the network level. This is where we group respondents together based on having similar overall types of aggregated networks. And some analytic techniques you could use for this are, for example, cluster analysis or latent class analysis or latent profile analysis, where you'd get certain types of respondents who have similar networks overall. A third approach for this is a combination of that, a person-centered approach, but it's where you then look at it by the network member. This is where you're grouping specific types of network members that have been nominated across our set of respondents who have similar characteristics, similar network characteristics. and similar techniques as number 2 that I just mentioned, but here you need to then again account for the nested nature of the network members nested within the ego or the respondent who nominated them. So you would need to use approaches such as a multi-level latent class analysis, for example. And I'll illustrate those numbers 2s and 3s with an analysis that we did. So the first one is at the network level, where we examined and looked at typologies of convoys. So again, this is at the network level, or typologies of networks aggregated. So we did a latent profile analysis. And again, it's a person-centered approach where it was based on, we included a number of different variables aggregated at the network level. So the structure like size or composition, proportion, family, et cetera. And then respondents were assigned into a categorical profile using the latent class approach. And then we compared a number of different model solutions to find out what was the strongest, best fitting model based on a number of different criteria using fit statistics, as well as what was the most simple explanation, as well as what made sense based on the theory. The second approach we did then was then within the networks. It was at that within network approach. So we were looking, instead of at typologies of convoys or typologies of networks, we were looking at typologies of convoy members. So these are types of people within the networks. And for this, the only difference was that we did a multi-level latent class analysis. We added a random intercept to capture the variability or account for that nested nature of the network members within the networks about the person who nominated them. So real briefly to show you like what you get from using these two different approaches. So these are the results from looking at typologies of convoys using the social relations data. And we got 3 different convoys, or 3 different typologies of convoys. So the first was comprised of networks that were predominantly geographically distant, so further away geographically, and they were comprised of more of younger family members. So we called that relocated children. There was a second convoy we found of people who were similarly aged as the respondent and also within the network, and also tended to be comprised of close families. So we thought of that as spouse, partner, and siblings. And a third convoy we found, which was comprised of 30% of the respondents had this type of convoy, was more diverse. So it was a mix of those who were similar aged peers and family members, a mix of stronger and weak ties. So it ranged from inner circle and outer circle ties, et cetera. So we thought of this as the more extended friends and neighbors typology of convoys. So their convoys typically described in this way. So again, this was at the network aggregated level. So when we did this using the other approach that is within networks, so looking at typologies of convoy members, it was a slightly different set of findings, and which makes sense because our spotlight or approach of analysis was slightly different. So we found a certain type of network members within the convoys across all the respondents, of one that was younger and tended to be all family and proximate, but also not proximate. So we considered that to be the children and grandchildren in the network, and we had to come up with a label to describe them. Because those of you who've done these mixture modeling approaches or these typology person-centered approaches, coming up with a label of what you call these is really kind of an art, or beyond the science of what you call those across these aggregated characteristics. So the second typology of network members we found was these older or weaker ties, and they were tended to be proximate and not family. So we considered these to be the neighbors or might be acquaintances in people's networks or convoys. The third typology of people was the oldest in terms of age, and they were weaker ties in those outer circles and proximate and not family. So again, another type, another group, distinct, but they were also neighbors and acquaintances. And the fourth one we found, which was people reporting the most contact, so most frequency of contact, they were the most proximate and almost all family. So we thought of this as probably most likely it's the spouse, partner, and other household members. We could have looked at it also based on the specific relationship to verify, indeed, if it was the spouse or partner. But for purposes of this analysis, we just did it with those compositional measure of family, not family. So one last example before we then take a break. I wanted to illustrate this one real briefly because I mentioned it before. It was a new measure that we added based on the education of the social network members. It was new added in the wave 2 of the social relations. And this one's an interesting measure because it's really at the intersection of both a person's achieved characteristics, so education, which a large literature has shown the link between education and health. But we also want to know then what's the access of education that a person might have through their social network members. But in this analysis, we then layered on top of that, looking at the education of the social network members by other aspects of the social network characteristics. So does the association between the education you have access to in your social network vary by the types of members whose education it is? So real briefly, here's the descriptive characteristics from this analysis where we show at the bottom is the education of those social network members. So on average, it was measured on a 5-point scale based on varying levels of education in the network. And on average, people's educations were pretty educated. Again, ranged from 1 to 5, from not at all, no education to all the way up to advanced degree. But then we looked at how the education of their closest network members, so that's the inner circle, it was about the same. Those who they have most contact with, and then also the education of their family members. So we could see how the education of these unique subgroups based on composition and structure measures varied. So here's what we found. It was interesting that when we looked at the education overall of the person's social network, that was not significantly associated with their overall self-rated health. But when we looked at it by these subdimensions of social network members, we did find some interesting effects. With particularly those closest network members, their education mattered most for the respondent's self-rated health. So those closest network members, their education mattered most. So having more educated people in your inner circle was associated with feeling better about your overall health. We also found significant effects for both contact frequency and family, but not as strong as those closest network members' education. So just a real brief snippet on that. Sorry, one more slide before we pause for questions on this and then take a short break. So one thing we wanted to mention, so I know focus on NIMLAS is longitudinal considerations. So we did want to make a couple of notes about if your research question is focused on, it has a longitudinal component, a couple of things you need to take into consideration. And whether or not your question is focused on a network level change or network member level changes that might change these considerations. So if you're focusing your question is at the network level, so for example, looking at predictors of changes in overall network size or overall geographic proximity of the network, this does not require tracking of specific network members over time. And one exception would be is if you're interested in at the network level, how much turnover is happening in the network or how much new people are added into the network. In that case, you would need to track individual network members. The second approach, if you are interested in specific network member level analyses like some of the examples I gave, so for example, predictors of why certain people leave the network or certain people get added, this does require tracking specific people over time. So there's two options that you could do this. You could do this in the context during the actual administration of the survey. So for example, some surveys do this, such as the National Health and Aging Trend Survey. And we have Sarah here, you could probably speak on this more, where actually the members are verified during the interview. So for example, where people are asked about, you mentioned so-and-so at his previous wave, is that person still included in your network, et cetera. And I'm sure I did not describe that exactly correct how NHATS does it, but as the example. The second way you could do this is you could do this after data collection, because the downside to including this in the interview is it adds time to your survey and it adds to burden. But the after data collection approach would be where you match based on the names. There is a level of degree of error into this because we found over time how people refer to people changes. So maybe when this person who is maybe their official name is William, they called them Billy when they were a child, but then they call them William or Bill when they're older. We had to make some sort of fair degree of assumption that that's the same person. So it might be less accurate. But fortunately, we had a number of variables where we could match this and verify that to some extent. So we knew if that same person was 12 years older, that it's likely Billy was Bill 12 years later. So a couple of notes on the longitudinal considerations. So just covered a lot with the examples. I'll pause. Is there any questions on any of what we covered before we take a short break and then move into the internet communications part?
Yes, not.
Okay. Well, Brady, does it work if we take a 5-minute short break and then I'll come back? So it looks like it's like 3:36 Eastern time. So what if we come back at like maybe in 5 minutes and start at 3:41?
Yep, that sounds good. And if anybody has questions that they want to put in the chat during the break, feel free, and we can go over those when we get back. So, yep, sounds good.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brady, we're gonna do the poll pretty much right when we get back, just a heads up. I'll introduce ICTs and then we'll go into it.
Sounds good. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Brady, I see a question about somebody you asked if we'd be able to provide key papers that use longitudinal measures. So there is one so we have a list of references at the end. So some of those are in there, but there is an additional one, a recent one where we looked at it over time. So I can what's the best way to send that? I'd have to stop sharing my screen to try and find that and drop it in the chat, but
You can share that with us, Noah, and we can share that as part of the workshop materials that eventually get posted on the NIMLAS website. So
okay, sounds good. I'll make note of that. And
yep.
thanks, Sung Hee, for the question. Is it okay if we get started?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Sounds good. All right, I'm going to turn it now over to Christine and Jess, who are going to lead us into the next part of this workshop on communication technologies.
Okay, great. Noah, can you advance the slide 1? Okay, so my name's Jess, if in case you guys don't remember. We wanted to start off this section with a brief poll, and we hope you can all participate in, because when we talk about ICTs, which are information and communication technologies, they seem ubiquitous, and we use them every day, but we might not really think about it. So this poll is just to get you thinking about your use of these technologies. So please go ahead and take a moment and complete the poll.
Oh yeah, sorry. It looks like they're not allowing check all that apply. They just allow to answer choices, so sorry about that.
Okay, well, keep it in
Or
mind.
maybe primary. Yeah.
Yeah, primary, and think about it, and we'll take it from there.
Really interesting.
Brady, will you let us know when we're approaching?
Yeah, right now we have about 76% that have participated, so
Thank you.
give it another minute or so here.
Okay.
Okay, one last call for any answers. Give it another 10 seconds or so here. Okay, I will go ahead and end the poll.
Okay. Thank you.
So hopefully everybody can see the responses at this point.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm just going through these on the fly. So again, obviously we couldn't select all that apply, but it looks like for on a daily basis, primary communication modality that we use seems to be texting, most likely to choose when you connect with your parent, cell phone, it's true for me. Most likely to choose when you connect with a friend, texting, also true for me. And with a younger family member, it looks like texting and video calling. So that's pretty interesting. And what I was wondering if anybody wanted to participate, if you wanted to unmute yourself or put something in the chat, what were some of your criteria? What were you thinking about when you made those decisions about what type of technology you would use to communicate with a different social tie?
Sarah says she thought about friends first. Yep.
And Sarah, what did you answer? Were you one of the folks who chose text with friends?
Yeah, sorry, I can turn on my
That's right.
yeah, so I just turned my camera off there. Hold on. Yeah, I said like text and social media messaging. Once I saw how many people said emails, I was like, oh, I wonder if people thought about work.
Yeah. We were going to add work as well at some point, but that's, yeah. So, and what made why when you text with your friends, you choose to text, is it out of ease of use? Most of them
Likelihood
text.
of response.
I'm sorry?
Likelihood of response.
Is it because they won't answer a phone call?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm on the cusp, generation-wise, of people who will answer the phone. It's very limited.
Yep, I totally hear you on that. I'm the same. And I probably I just thinking about myself and my network, for me, if I see a friend, one of my peers call me, I get a little panicked because I think it's going to be something significant that we're going to talk about, good or bad. But if my parent is calling me, I think that's pretty much par for the course, and I'm not as worked up about it. I chose for myself, my parents are in their 60s and 70s. I said for talking with my parent, I use the phone, and that's mainly because, we do text. I prefer the phone because my parents fall into a generation that uses questionable punctuation in their text messaging, which usually, again, creates an anxiety within me that's just not worth dealing with, because I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but if your mother texts you at like 6 a.m. in the morning, call me, period, you're calling immediately and you're bracing yourself for impact. So that's, some of the considerations I've had. See, someone else wrote, I thought about parents first. So what mode of communication did you choose for your parents?
I chose phone call.
Phone
We
call.
call a lot and we talk nearly every day, so
And
it's very common.
when you choose the phone for your folks, is it your preference or their preference, or is it a joint mutual preference?
Oh, I never thought about that. I think it's huh. I don't know. Maybe it's my default preference because I prefer to hear them.
Okay,
Or I actually think they will respond to the call faster than a text message.
absolutely.
It's probably likely that the message lingers, but they'll listen for the phone ringing, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anya said more risk of spams with calls than with texts. That
Interesting.
is also true, especially in this day and age. Okay, Noah, would you mind advancing the slide?
Yeah, and I'll stop. Do you want me to stop sharing the poll?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And thank you all
Okay.
for participating in that. So as you saw in the poll, when we talk about information and communication technologies, we're talking about predominantly internet, email, mobile phones, video chat, social network sites, smart apps, virtual reality, etc. This is a rapidly evolving field, so it's fun to study. But basically what we're talking about is mediated communication, computer-mediated communication by and large. I could talk about this for years, and I guess at this point I have, but I can sum it up for time's sake and say that a lot of the considerations, if not all of them, that Noah discussed about our social networks, we have to take into consideration when we talk about ICT use as well. It's a way that we are connecting with others. These are tools that we use for connection. So we have to consider context, relationship, preferences, frequency of communication. And when we talk about when we're talking about the different modes and we're talking about this idea of mediated communication, it absolutely, these devices, these tools will absolutely have an impact on your relationship, whether it's a lasting impact or just a very acute momentary impact. It impacts the way that we choose to communicate with one another and some of the misunderstandings and some of the risks that we take as well. So when we talk about different types of ICTs, one thing to consider when we're talking about connecting with others, and that some of you have even alluded to already in the poll, is this idea of a synchronous versus asynchronous channel of communication. So, when we were talking about, well, I call my parents because I like to hear their voice, because that's preferable, right? So that's a synchronous type of communication. We're having a conversation more similar to an in-person conversation. Asynchronous communication channels are more like text. Although text really walks a line between asynchronous and synchronous, because it can be both. And that's where a lot of room for miscommunication comes in. But with asynchronous, we send a message to somebody, they can take their time to respond to it. We're not standing right in front of them. We're not on the phone with them. We're not on video chat with them. It might be an email, right? They can read it, process it, respond to it in kind. And that asynchronous communication has an impact on how we connect with others. And at times it can be very interpersonal, and at times it can be very impersonal. And we might choose to communicate via synchronous or asynchronous channel based on our relationship quality or how we want to impact our relationships, if that's what you choose. In this case, I would think about, like, if you've ever been on a dating app and you're going on this app for the express purpose to form a relationship, right? You are connecting with somebody via asynchronous connection, and those first few messages that you send, you craft, you put your profile out there, you put your best foot forward, and you try to connect with somebody else. Eventually, ideally, you move offline and suddenly you are synchronous. And sometimes those two profiles don't really match up. And a lot of us may have been in that situation, but it just goes to show that, there can be a different person on the end of any of these channels. So consider the mode, consider the type of channel that you're using and how that might impact your ability to communicate and connect. Also, access, use, benefits are all determined by socioeconomic and demographic factors. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth later. But for right now, for a case study, we're going to talk about aging and technology use. So now if you could advance one slide, thank you. So we're all in our group, a lot of us are very interested in aging, and the older adult community is one that has a unique relationship with technology use. They're traditionally seen as folks who adopt technology less readily than younger age groups, but they also have the potential to reap a greater benefit in a lot of cases. We've seen in many studies that social technology use or ICT use is associated with lower levels of loneliness, depressive symptoms, social isolation, and a greater sense of mattering to others. And this is different than we would see in some cases with younger folks. For instance, when you're talking about social media use and loneliness among younger adults or kids, it's a mixed bag when we talk about loneliness. We see mixed results. It's very context-based. There are a lot of factors that fall into, looking at the idea of social media use and its impact on loneliness for younger people. For older adults, we kind of more consistently see that there's a benefit to older adults' social connection when it comes to social media use. We also tend to maybe have a more reticent attitude with social media use when it comes to younger folks. There's typically a response when we talk about, forming relationships online that tends to be tinged with negativity, or, if our kids are only on their phones and only connecting with each other virtually, then how are they going to develop social skills? For older adults who've spent more of their life engaging without this type of technology, that's less of a concern. Their social skills are less of a concern. And really what we're talking about is a bridge to connect with others. These ICTs become tools of connection, bridging gaps, and their affordances really give us an opportunity to connect with those who might be at more risk to become disconnected. Older adults are one of the groups that are consistently considered to be digitally divided, meaning that they have less access, but they are the group that has been shown to stand to benefit the most from this use. So this is of particular interest to me and to my colleagues, because you just see there's a gap here that needs to be addressed, and it's time to do so. And this is particularly important because, as we see, we live in an aging world. A lot of us here study aging. There's going to be more older adults alive on the planet in the next 5 years than have ever existed in human history. So being able to connect with one another, connect with valuable resources, and use these tools and have older adults be able to use these tools effectively is more important than ever before. So with that in mind, the folks here at LCD decided that it's time to adapt the social convoy model, and I want to hand it over now to Christina Jrusch to talk about this new iteration.
Thanks, Jess. So now we're going to turn to an adaptation of the convoy model, which considers the new ways in which ICTs, or information communication technologies, impact social relations and well-being across the lifespan and the life course. Noah, could you go to the next slide, please? So just to revisit the assumptions of the convoy model, which Noah shared with us so eloquently earlier, just recall, social relations are thought to be multidimensional. They're influenced by various personal and situational characteristics, as well as relationship types. And they have far-reaching effects on psychological and physical well-being. Technological developments are fundamentally changing social relations and the ways in which people relate to one another. I mean, Jess just gave a great discussion about all the things we need to consider, like synchronous and asynchronous, and the ways in which it impacts our willingness to connect with people. The technological advances have provided new methods of contact. So just consider the evolution from in-person contact and letter writing to the telegraph and telephone, and most recently to the ever more individualized and electronic forms of contact, such as cell phones, video calls like Skype and FaceTime. Actually, Skype, I guess, is going by the wayside, but FaceTime, and you can WhatsApp video call people. their social media, such as, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, we know very little about how different forms of communication influence social relations, health, and well-being. The evolving modes of contact and the communication that are available potentially produce new types and effects of social relations. Our team has been working to develop and test new measures of contact frequency mode that will differentiate contact type. Are you texting? Are you video chatting? Are you using social media? Are you using your cell phone? Are you seeing people in person? As well as the content of those communications. As stipulated in the convoy model, we recognize the importance of differentiating specific relationship types, who you're communicating with, your parent, your child, your friend, your coworker, and how they evolve over time. So in adapting the convoy model, we begin with the issue of contact mode in recognition of the increasing complexity of social relations and its influence on well-being. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks, Noah. So the modes of contact available have expanded exponentially over the last several decades. The internet, which emerged over 30 years ago, initiated multiple new means by which people connect and communicate. Today, smartphones are revolutionizing communication patterns. And as a matter of fact, there are scholars in the field who really focus on ICTs who predict that in the very near future, we will have little chips in our skin that'll be like smartphones where we don't even have to carry our phone anymore. It'll just be part of our body. So it's smartphones are very, very central to people's well-being. Oftentimes people walk around with their phone, and if they left their phone somewhere, it's a huge concern, and people have to go get their phone. They can't be without their phone. So it's profoundly changing how we connect to others, but with little regard to the psychological and sociological effects of these changes. We're no longer restricted by having to be at a particular place to connect. I remember when I was first in college, and my parents used to be so mad if I didn't call them every day. And at that time, we didn't have cell phones. It was just the landlines. And I was so busy going to school. And I used to think, God, I wish I could just talk to them while I was driving. And I would have to wait till I got home from school so that I could call them. And it was just, it was a very different kind of dynamic in terms of connecting with a family member. Now, the connections are made between individuals wherever they are instead of individuals in specific locations. Moreover, smartphone and social media developments via internet capacity has extended the reach of any one individual, increasing the ways we can connect with other people. So while increasing connectivity at one level, concern has also been raised that these electronic forms of communication lack the close personal connecting that informs an individual of how others are reacting to their communication. Therefore, the immediate contingency of in-person contact is lost sometimes. All of these considerations are important for thinking about the form and function of social interactions and relationships and all of the things that we take into account as we're thinking about adapting the convoy model. So next, I want to illustrate the adaptation with an exercise about mapping your cell phone network. Noah, could you go to this next one? So to illustrate one adaptation of the convoy model and the use of the hierarchical mapping technique, we'd like to present the case of cell phone networks. So some questions our team have grappled with include, how does having a cell phone influence relationships? Does it shape expectations about the ability to connect with someone? How do you use your phone for advice and/or for support? So I'm going to ask you to draw another set of concentric circles to illustrate one way of adapting this approach for thinking about cell phone networks. So again, if you have a piece of paper, go ahead and draw the concentric circles. To get it straight, I'm going to ask you to help me draw a diagram, which we're going to refer to as your cell phone network. And so you would write you in the middle, and then the first circle around you would include only those persons that you feel you must be in contact with via your cell phone, people who are important, but you could go without immediate access via your cell phone would go into the second circle. And then people you feel are less important to have contact with via your cell phone would go into the third circle. Just like in the convoy model, circles can be empty, full, or anywhere in between. Once a cell phone network is identified, we can ask questions about the people you communicate with by cell phone. So let's begin. So thinking about the first ring around you, is there any one person or persons that you feel you must be in contact with via your cell phone? And if there is, we would ask that you write down the first name and last initial and numbering them, in the circle closest to you. So we'll give you a couple of minutes just to think about that. So it's a different way of thinking about your social relationships, right? Like, who is it that you have to be in contact with via your cell phone? Oh, sorry, Noah, could you go to the next slide? Oops, no, go back. Okay, yeah, we're at first circle. Thanks. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly just because I know that we should end at 4:30, and you kind of get the gist of it from the first exercise Noah did. So going to the second circle, are there people to whom you feel are important, but you could go without immediate access via your cell phone? You'd put them in the second circle. Again, first name, last initial, number them. Okay, and then the next slide, please, Noah. Are there people whom you haven't already mentioned, but are in contact with you via your cell phone? Okay, Noah, can you go to the next slide? I know I'm moving kind of fast, but I just want to make sure we have time to also have questions. Okay, now that you identified your cell phone network, just like we illustrated with the original convoy model, you can tally up the number of people identified for a total cell phone network size, as well as tally up according to levels of importance or contact immediacy, as defined by each circle placement. Next, again, for the first five, let's say you have at least 5 people, you can ask them, or I'm sorry, you can ask questions of the people that were listed in a social network, I'm sorry, in a cell work network diagram according to your research questions. I have a couple of examples up here on the screen. For example, for the first person, what's their relationship to you? Is it, friend, family, coworker, etc. A couple of other questions that are unique to cell phones. The first one might be, what is the prominent method of communication with them? Do you text only? Text more than talk? Talk and text equally? Talk more than text, or talk only? And for this one, once you do it for all 5 people in your networks, you could then, for example, come up with an average on the text talk continuum of what your cell phone network looks like. The second question you might ask about members in your cell phone network is, how quickly does this person return your contact? Would you say immediately? Within half an hour? Within the day? Within the week? Or irregularly? And here you might come up with a network measure of the proportion of your network that returns the contact immediately. So you get a sense here of how, the hierarchical mapping technique is being used to measure social relations that are quite distinct from the traditional way in which we think about it, which is people that you're connected with through your social network. I'm going to turn now to an empirical example where we applied the adapted convoy model to examine contact frequency mode. If you can go, yeah, thanks, Noah. So this example looks at the extent to which relationship quality at one point in time predicted contact mode frequency at a later point in time. And we asked and we wanted to know if it was moderated by age. In other words, does the link between relationship quality and contact mode frequency vary according to whether you're younger or older? So the first question we asked is, does relationship quality influence contact mode frequency? So if you think about competing hypotheses of the ways in which there could be an impact, since there's so little research on this topic, given the growing use of smartphones, phone and texting contact may be more common than in person when relationships are marked by more positive and less negative quality. For example, it could be reserved for those about whom I feel good about. Or conversely, it could be that phone and texting contact may be more common than in person when relationships are marked by more negative and less positive quality. For example, I can get away with not seeing people because I can talk to them by phone or text. And this may be more likely for contact with children and friend than with spouse or parents. It may also be more pronounced among younger rather than older adults, given that technology is used more by younger adults in this way. So our second aim is asking, does the way in which relationship quality influences contact mode frequency vary by age? Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of how we measured contact frequency mode, is that we asked our respondents to respond to 4 sets of questions about the frequency with which they see their network member in person, the frequency to which they talk to them by phone, the frequency by which they video chat with that person, and we gave examples such as Skype, FaceTime, or Google Hangouts. And then how often they communicate with him or her by text, email, or social media. So this was all kind of like a texting kind of communication. And respondents could respond from irregular, it was a scale with irregularly / never all the way to every day. And then we grouped these as in-person, telephone, and we combined the video chat and the texting, email, et cetera, into electronic modes of contact. Next slide, please. And then we measured relationship quality. Noah has kind of already gone over these, but we used our standard positive and negative relationship quality. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea of the contact frequency mode by relationship type, we had 557 people who were part of the longitudinal social relations study. They ranged in age from 30 to 99 years old, and their average age was about 60 years old. What you can see first, if you take a look at the orange bars, which indicate electronic contact frequency mode, electronic contact frequency was lowest in communicating with parents. So if you look at the mother and father, their levels were lowest. The in-person contact mode was highest in communicating with a spouse, and that's that yellow bar. If you look at the spouse, they had the highest in-person contact. And the blue bar, which represents telephone contact, was a consistent mode, similar at all levels for all relationship types. So it just kind of gives you a little snapshot of how contact frequency mode may vary by relationship type. Next slide, please. Okay, so we had a lot of different modes that we looked at, but for brevity purposes, we're just going to present the electronic contact frequency results that we had, because it's like a newer kind of having newer type of or way of having a social relationship. So the focus here on electronic contact frequency, first thing to note is that though the link between positive quality and electronic contact frequency does not vary across relationship type, so it doesn't matter whether or not you have a positive relationship with your mother, father, child, spouse, or friend. It's positive relationship quality doesn't really link or associate with contact frequency electronically. However, age does. Regardless of the relationship type, being younger is associated with higher levels of electronic contact frequency. And they're really, I mean, we had a little bit of a trend, but we didn't pay much attention to that with regards to positive quality and age with spouse. Going to the next slide, when it comes to negative relationship quality, there does appear to be a distinct pattern concerning the mother-child relationship. So respondents who reported on their relationship with their mother, if they reported higher negative quality with their mother, that was associated with less electronic communication. Age patterns were similar. Again, you were younger, you had more electronic communication, and there was a significant interaction concerning contact with a child. So respondents who reported on their children. Next slide, please, Noah. So if you look at the red dotted line, which represents a statistically significant slope, we observe that the high negative relationship quality predicts less frequent electronic contact with children among older adults. The association is not statistically significant among younger adults who are reporting on their children. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Jess, who's going to present considerations for recruitment, measurement, and analysis of social tech networks. Jess?
Thank you very much. So we're going to lead into, I mentioned it before, the digital divide. And this is a pretty dense concept that we're going to go over very quickly. But as Christine has highlighted in the study that she was just talking about, there's a difference, right? Younger versus older when it comes to frequency of tech use. And as we mentioned before, older adults tend to be consistently digitally divided. So the digital divide is an ever-evolving model of digital connectedness, and it started predominantly as this sort of way to describe gaps in access to digital technology, and then it quickly expanded from there. Now there are multiple levels. I would say pretty commonly we talk about 3 levels of the digital divide. However, there are plenty of folks who have added different dimensions to those levels that should be studied. But across the board, we typically talk about access to technology, use, which is also referred to as a skill gap, which tends to relate to education on how to use the technologies, the quality of the technologies that folks have access to. So that is related to cost of technologies and level of income, and then empowerment to use the technologies. So something that's important to consider here is that an oversimplification would be that digitally divided groups are marginalized groups. So when we think about marginalized groups in our society, these folks are oftentimes also at risk of being digitally divided. It's not exclusive, but it's consistent enough that it should help us sort of frame our thought process around this idea of the digital divide. It's also a global phenomenon, so it's not just in this country, but it basically stems from, policies and systemic considerations and prejudices and biases and priorities, at the governmental level, policy level, as well as the societal level. And it has an impact. And if anything should really highlight that, it would be the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of us were, all of us were sent home at some point and told, continue your work, continue your studies, continue your life online, virtually. And we were told that relatively, in short order, with not a lot of time to adapt. For a lot of us who are more privileged, we could adapt to that. There were A lot of folks, however, who could not, whether they did not have computers in the home, they did not have internet access, Wi-Fi, they did not have the tech know-how or training to be able to move their entire life or school or job to online or the virtual world. They were left out. Similarly speaking, as Noah mentioned, earlier on, we talk about the importance of our social networks when it comes to, mobilizing in, times of disaster and extreme weather. And we oftentimes see, when it comes to thinking of, Flint water crisis, the flooding in Texas, folks who were disproportionately impacted by such events. One group was older adults. Why might that be so? Well, there's a number of reasons based on where they're living, mobility issues, maybe smaller social networks, but also a lot of the disaster relief and aid was online. So app information of where you're going to get your clean water in Flint. Being able to geolocate yourself to communicate with first responders during the floods. I'm here, I need help. That was app-based by and large. There are obviously other services provided, but for folks who don't use technology or are not as familiar with technology or don't have the access to it in their homes, in their daily lives, or high quality technology, they are absolutely at risk in these extreme situations. Basically, when it comes down to it, is more and more technology is becoming a lifeline and an absolute necessity, but it's still treated as a luxury item. So that is something to keep in mind when you're doing this type of work, when you're either recruiting with technology or studying technology within the realm of our social networks, that not everybody has the same relationship with technology, and it's not necessarily due to any sort of lack on the individual's part, but actually, it's sort of how society has embraced technology and those who use it. The next point I wanted to just kind of following along with that, recruitment bias potential. If you're recruiting using technology, about technology use, you're going to have a pretty skewed sample, and that you're going to primarily get folks who are fairly tech savvy because they're already communicating with you online. To connect with folks who are truly disconnected, you got to get a little bit creative. For older adults, I've been told, engaging with Meals on Wheels and their networks is a great way to connect with folks. Also, going to senior centers and communicating both with folks who are at the senior centers, as well as getting access to their mailing lists for their events bulletins. That is another great way to recruit folks who might be divided. Again, this digital divide also impacts who gets to have a voice in research and whose needs we truly understand at the end of the day. And lastly, we've been talking about this quite a bit with social relations, but it's just understanding users and your participants. So again, everybody has unique needs, unique profiles, and unique uses for this type of technology. Again, it might be influenced by the digital divide. It might be influenced just by preferences or opportunities to engage. When we're talking about your social network, as Christine demonstrated, there might be a difference between your cell phone network and your total social network. There might be folks, and probably are folks, who are in both networks. There might be folks who are exclusive to one network or the other network. It's important to understand that when you're talking about, how you're engaging with folks, how many people are in your network, to get an accurate picture of the social network, both online and offline. As an example, I'm doing a study right now with virtual reality, where we are looking at people's social connections entirely in the virtual world. So avatar to avatar, these people ideally will not meet outside of the virtual realm. And we're looking at those relationships and trying to understand the impact that they have and eventually compare it to in-person relationships. So again, just keeping in mind that these networks can be hybrid, they can be strictly online, strictly offline, and that it really changes with the person. So it really follows along with everything we've talked about with the considerations for studying social networks. ICTs just add depth and a nuance to, you know, how we need to consider each one of these aspects of our social networks and how we're communicating and maintaining these connections. I think at this point, if there's any questions about the entire presentation, happy to take them at this point.
Yes, thanks everyone. Let's have a couple minutes for some questions here, and then we can wrap up in conclusion. So, I don't see any new questions in the chat. So if anybody does have questions right now, feel free to unmute yourself and raise your question. Not hearing any right now. You do have contact information for the workshop presenters, so you can certainly follow up with everyone. Again, we're going to post the slides and other related materials shortly after this workshop has concluded. So you can find all the materials and other information up on the NIMLAS website, in addition to the recording of the workshop. If you'd like to share that with your other colleagues, we'll work on getting that processed earlier next week and then posted on the NIMLAS website. So, okay, I'll leave it to the four presenters if you guys have any final comments or like to say anything else before we conclude here.
I just want to say, so the second to last slide is some further reading, and this is some of the stuff that was referenced earlier in the presentation. And as Brady asked, I'll also include a longitudinal study, recent paper published along with the rest of the materials. But just wanted to say thank you to you all for the engagement and all the questions, and just want to thank the co-presenters as well. It was a fun experience, and thank you again.
Yeah, I just add my thanks. Thanks for having us, Brady. Really enjoyed it.
No, thank you guys for doing this. Really appreciate it. So, and I hope that everybody watching on the recording as well will take a lot of useful information out of this. So, yep.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good weekend.
Me
You as
too.
well.
Thank you.
Thank you.